What's up, you guys? Welcome to The Imagination. I'm your host, Emma, and today I'm honored to introduce you all to LDS abuse whistleblower, investigative researcher, journalist, and reporter with a master's degree in adult education and training, creator of LDS Abuse, excommunicated lifelong member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, loving father, nature lover, and a man on a mission to help members of the spiritual body known as the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints know what to expect from their church if they become victims of abuse. Justin Riggs. In case you're new here or missed Justin's first episode, here's a little bit about him and what we discussed last time to catch you guys up. A lifelong member of Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, Justin was recently excommunicated from the church earlier this year for his work, which ironically aims to help cultivate a safer environment in the church for abuse victims, children, and survivors. As many of you know from listening to this podcast or similar podcasts, religious institutions have, over time, become cesspools of abuse to happen and for abusers to hide, and the LDS Church is no exception. This is not to say that all members of the church are corrupt or bad. This is to say that Justin has revealed some hidden connections that have been in plain sight all along, connecting the LDS Church to a long-standing relationship with the CIA, as well as exposing the systemic problem of ritual abuse that has since manifested into countless testimonies from survivors who were preyed on by perpetrators hiding behind the goodwill and secrecy embedded into the church's very foundations. In Justin's words, when people get abused in the church and seek help, they think they're going to be treated as a child of God, but instead they learn very quickly that their experience is dangerous to the brand of LDS Inc., and they get treated like a human resource problem. The first time Justin was on, we had a mind-blowing discussion around the PACE memo, which was a leaked document that disclosed ongoing internal investigations of ritual abuse, pedophilia, and Satanism in the LDS Church being conducted by church leadership who documented and covered up dozens and dozens of ritual abuse victim and survivor testimonies. This documentation has surprisingly received very little attention for how serious this issue was, and it's only because researchers like Justin that we even know it exists at all. We also discussed the LDS Church and their long-standing relationship with the CIA, and how the abuse these victims were alleging is eerily similar to the testimonies of the many LDS Church ritual abuse and MKUltra survivors and whistleblowers we've seen and had on this podcast. If you missed that episode, I highly, highly encourage you to go watch it, and I will have it linked in the show notes below. On today's episode, Justin is going to go even deeper into this rabbit hole by presenting additional shocking documentation that shows and proves how there was actually a plan to take over the state of Utah by overthrowing Mormonism and taking possession of the mineral-rich land. That plan involved corrupting the youth of the church by recruiting them into occult secret societies, then feeding them into positions of power, influence, and gain in government, business, religion, intelligence agencies, and the military-industrial complex. And this is just the tip of the iceberg. Our goal with this series is not to degrade or put down religion, church, or anyone's specific beliefs. It is to help bring awareness to corruption happening in places like the church so that we can collectively come together and demand change in order to make these spaces safe again for children, survivors, and victims. So you guys grab a pen and paper and get ready to take copious notes about one of the biggest and most important scandals the world has no idea exists until now. Before I finish introducing today's guest, I wanted to give just a couple quick reminders and updates. If you'd like to be on the show, share any information privately with me, or send me a written testimony for my upcoming book series or to be written in a Substack article, you can email me at imagineabetterworld2020@gmail.com or standbysurvivors@protonmail.com. I've also partnered with a couple of my favorite brands to get you guys discount codes on a couple of my favorite products, including Rife Technology frequency machines and blockers and CZTL's high-quality methylene blue. All the links and codes for these amazing products, as well as the rest of my links, are in the show notes, and I'd love your support across all platforms. As some of you may know, my beloved YouTube channel was recently terminated off YouTube, and I'm being forced to pivot and use other streaming platforms to disseminate this very important information out to the public and disclosure community. Your support on those platforms would mean the world to me, and I'm streaming right now on Rumble and X and Substack, where I can communicate directly with you guys through email. Thank you all for helping to make the imagination the safest space on the internet for survivor, whistleblower, advocate, and educator disclosures. So you guys, without further ado, please help me in welcoming today's guest of honor, writer, creator, business owner, and content creator, whistleblower, survivor, and victim advocate, voice for the voiceless, and my dear friend, Justin Riggs, aka LDS Abuse. Justin, thank you so much for being here again with us today.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thank you so much for having me again. I really do appreciate it.
Absolutely. Your first episode not only blew my mind, but I know everybody that watched it, the response was really crazy, just how many people had no idea that this existed. I wanted to see if there's anything that I missed in the intro, if people are new here, if you wanted to catch anybody up, and we can start diving into your presentation for today.
Great. Yeah, no, I love what you just said because that really is sort of the thrust of my work, especially at this point. So, I talk about it as shifting the Overton window, which I don't know if you've ever heard of that, but the Overton window is really when powerful institutions set up what they want you to see, they'll set up what's called the Overton window. And when you have something that is so hard for people to believe, like satanic ritual abuse or that kind of a thing, occult crime, then in order to even have the conversation, you have to be able to shift that Overton window, don't you? Because as you mentioned, if you just bring it up in conversation, people are going to just kind of blow you off, right? So what I hope through my work is that what I'm doing is setting a strong foundation. And I want to be clear that my work is just a hypothesis. And just like any other hypothesis, it can be tested scientifically. And like in my case, I'm very encouraged by what I found because we've identified a lot of patterns that seem to hold true across 150 to 200 years, right? And inside of Mormonism, it holds true. And now what we're beginning to see is that it might hold true inside of other religions as well. Like last week, I have a Twitter follower who introduced me to a man by the name of Albert Mohler, I believe is how you say that, who's a Baptist, whose life follows a very similar pattern to the kinds of Mormons that we're used to seeing, who's also been involved in some scandals inside of the Baptist church. So overall, I really appreciate your introduction because this is not me getting up and trying to pretend to be a prophet, which happens a lot in Mormonism. Like when people get disaffected in the Mormon church, they tend to want to take authority that's not theirs because they're so culturally conditioned to to listen to authority that they want to become an authority, and that's not what I'm here to do. Like I am here to go through old newspapers. I'm here to go through old yearbooks. I'm here to go to talk to people who have been in situations who know things, and I'm here to document it. And I'm not a trained historian, but hopefully by the end of this, people will look at this as a history project more than an advocacy project. And then the idea is that there is this hidden history inside the Mormon church that has patterns that might apply outside of the Mormon church as well. And today is the episode that I kind of like to refer to as the rest of the story. Now, I'm old. I don't know how old you are, Emma, but I'm old enough to remember driving in the car with my mom, and we would listen to the radio, and there was a guy by the name of Paul Harvey. And Paul Harvey would come on and he would give you the rest of the story. And that was one of my favorite things because he would take something that you thought you knew about, and then he would give you the underlying documentation and the rest of that story. And today is the rest of the story because our first episode was about the Pace Memo, which is the most explosive piece of evidence outside of maybe the relationship with the CIA, but I think even probably more so. I think that Pace Memo is probably the strongest piece of evidence to show that there's a hidden history inside the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And we spent almost 2 hours talking pretty much strictly about that. Today, what I'm going to do is show everybody the rest of the story. And we're going to draw like on almost 200, well, about 150 years of history showing the pattern of immoral, unethical, and illegal behavior by Mormon church leaders that I think helps me understand. Well, let me put that differently. It does help me understand why the church behaves the way it does when there are cases of abuse inside of their church. My hope is that it will help others also understand and that it's not just all in my head. And so I really appreciate the opportunity to come here and present this because the only way to find out if your arguments are good is to put them in front of the world and let the world try to tear them down, right? So I like to say, if anybody has a better argument, you should reach out to Emma. She told you how to reach out to be on her show. And if you feel like you have a better argument than the one that I have with more evidence, then I'm sure Emma would love to have you on the show to explain how you think that this happens. So with that being said, I'll go ahead and share out my screen and let's just go ahead and get started because we always have a lot of information. And I know that I have a limited attention span. And so I try to be respectful of other people too.
I could totally listen to this all day. It's so fascinating. It applies to so many other things outside of the church, like you said, but it really, illustrates how this actually happens on a grand scale. And I think, like I said, it can help construct that in somebody's mind who's very critical or doesn't want to believe or can't believe that something this great and grand could happen in, let's just say, a church institution.
Yeah. Well, so and it's really funny, Emma, because like my training is really religious in what I'm doing here because in my church I grew up being taught that there's a pattern in all things. And the reason that the Lord gives us a pattern in all things is so that we won't be deceived. So the biggest pattern that I want people to keep in mind that I always talk about in every interview that I do, except for I think the last one that we did, which is kind of funny, but let's introduce this concept today. And the pattern is anybody can say anything, but actions reveal intent. And what I'm trying to get people to understand and see it, and because this is what I see, and again, it could just be me seeing it, but I think it's not just me seeing it. And I think I have plenty of evidence to prove that it's not just me seeing it. But what I see in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is a group of men at the top of the church who say really wonderful, beautiful things. You listen to General Conference, you go to an event where they're at, and all of their words feel good, right? And there's a lot of different reasons for that. The church employs some marketing firms, like one called Heart Cell in particular. And so it's not all what I would consider organic. But what they tell you is that that's you feeling the spirit, right? And if you're feeling the spirit, then it has to be true. But there's a problem for me with that presentation because I can say anything that I want to. Satan can say anything that he wants to. We have to look at the actions of the people who are sharing the message in order to get a real sense of who it is that we're affiliating with, supporting, and sustaining. And in the case of the leaders of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, what I would suggest is that there's a pattern of immoral, unethical, and illegal behavior that we need to pay closer attention to before we decide whether we want to sustain, support, and affiliate with this particular group of men who now run this church, which is really, I would say, not much church anymore and a whole lot of corporation. That's just my opinion, right? And I'm going to show you how that happened. So let's start with one of the major reasons that I decided to like latch onto this bone and not let go of it. And the reason is that Russell M. Nelson, who's pictured here, is the prophet of the church right now and the president of the corporation. And so, as we talked about a little bit last time, in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, the prophet of the church is always the president of the corporation. And at this point, they both have the same name. They both go by the name, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Well, when you look at Russell M. Nelson's life, there's a lot of problems with his actions. And that's okay. We're all human and we all have problems with our actions. My biggest problem with Russell M. Nelson is that I can't find any indication of repentance in his life, which is kind of important as a Christian and a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. So I can find a lot of him saying wonderful things, and I can find a lot of him making some really poor choices. What I can never find is Russell M. Nelson standing up and telling the world, hey, I made some really poor choices, like joining Sigma Chi, for example, and partaking of the Black Supper, which we're going to talk about a little bit today, or joining Skull and Bones, or I don't know, a lot of different things that Russell M. Nelson has done, right? Protecting the pedophile Bill Karstensen is probably the biggest one that concerns me at this point. But the problem is that Russell M. Nelson never gets up and says that. What he gets up and says is things like this, where we have a YouTube video and he's in California at a regional conference and he says, there are 15 on the earth today. You can trust them completely, as he's speaking about truth. And Emma, I know I gave you that link to that video. If we want to try, we can just let people hear it from Russell M. Nelson's mouth instead of wondering whether or not I just slapped some CCs over the top of a video and making a wild claim. So I'll go ahead and turn it over to you if you want to try. Do I need to stop sharing before we do that?
Toward our heavenly home, I plead with you to stay focused on what you know to be true. Increase what you know by studying from sources you can trust. Seek for answers to your questions through prayer, searching the scriptures, and studying the words of prophets, seers, and revelators. There are 15 on the earth today. You can trust them completely.
So I'll go ahead and take back the screen share then. But what I want people to recognize is what just happens in a statement like that. When a Mormon goes to a conference and hears Russell M. Nelson say something like that, he's talking about truth. And truth has a very specific definition in the church, which I'm not going to talk about today because I'm not here to preach sermons. But what people hear when Russell M. Nelson says, in order to seek truth, you should pray, which I agree with. You should study your scriptures, which I agree with. And then he lumps in, there are 15 men on the face of the earth that you can trust completely who are prophets, seers, and revelators. That is an incredibly powerful statement by an incredibly powerful man. And I would just suggest that if we're going to do that, we should look at the actions of those men to make sure that they are 15 men that you can actually trust completely. It is important for people to understand that, Justin Riggs is a pretty traumatized individual. And because of my trauma, I don't trust pretty much anybody. And so, I'm not suggesting that people should not trust Russell M. Nelson and the other 14 men that run the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints because Justin Riggs says so. I am suggesting that everybody should do the hard work of learning about not just the words of these men, but also their actions so that they can pray and use their scriptures to make wise decisions about whether they should trust these 15 men completely. I clearly don't. And I don't want to pretend that I do. And I'm not here to obfuscate or occult the fact that I don't trust these men. I've written an entire blog article about why I don't trust these men. But I'm not asking people to believe me. I'm asking people to utilize these other things that Russell M. Nelson says that we should utilize in order to determine whether or not we should trust them completely. Today, I'm going to be focused on showing you reasons why I believe that you should not. Everybody should do the hard work of finding reasons that they should. I've certainly done that work, but I only have a certain number of hours to do these shows, and I need to show the evidence of why I believe that we need to be a little bit careful about trusting these men completely. Okay. So the first thing I want to point out about how all of this may have gone down is that in 1896, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints had a problem. They needed a corporate structure in order to make sure that they didn't lose their property and that there was sort of a continuation process as church presidents died. There was a really big problem when Joseph Smith died, and there was a succession crisis. And that succession crisis was not just about leadership, it was also about property. And so in 1896, the church or the leaders of the church decided to look at what would be the best way to protect the succession and the property of the church. And here's what they came up with. It says, most corporations are fictitious persons who legally represent some collective of natural persons, such as members of a church or shareholders in a company. A corporation's soul, however, is the legal instantiation of an office, such as the King of England or the Archbishop of Canterbury, that has but a single occupant. Crucially, however, the corporation's soul is distinct from the natural person who occupies the office, and it thus persists when that person dies or when a new person takes office. Richards likely took his inspiration from the Catholic hierarchy in the United States. The importance of this is that Richards, down on the bottom, is the Mormon who is tasked with figuring out how to solve this problem. And what we see is that there is this legal fiction called the corporation's soul, or this legal entity called the corporation's soul. And what the church decided to do was to utilize the corporation's soul, which basically creates a king or an archbishop, right, that allows for the church to protect its property inside of the personhood of a natural, what do they call it? It's the natural person. So that would be the prophet or the president of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. But it's a very weird sort of legal framework. And as this points out, it's a very Catholic framework. And there's a long discussion about why the church decided to settle on this. But in the end, I think that it's really problematic. And one of the reasons I think it's really problematic is I don't see any indication that this decision was made through revelation. And for those who aren't members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, that probably doesn't make a ton of sense. But every decision made by the leaders of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, especially the prophets and apostles, is supposed to be done by revelation. And I see no indication that any revelation was given that the church should set up a corporation sole that vests all of the property and power in one individual. In fact, I see a lot of evidence that that would not be very pleasing to the Lord in the other standard works of the church. But again, I'm not going to go into that too deeply because that's more theology than it is history or anything like that. Does this all make sense? This is a little bit tricky, and I want to make sure that I'm explaining it in a way that makes sense. But the idea here is that the church had a problem, and the way that they chose to solve it was to vest all power in one individual, and that individual is the prophet and president of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Does that make sense? Okay. So before I really get going on the history side of it, I really just want to point out that, like, again, I'm LDS abuse. There are many different things that we could look at in terms of like what the consequences of all of what I'm going to share today and like what the consequences of that are in the broader context of things. But I study abuse. Yesterday, I went and I just asked Grok on X. I said, can you list 10 immoral, unethical, or illegal things Mormon leaders have done in the last 100 years? And here's what I want to point out. Grok returned the following result for me. So for those of you who don't know, Grok is Twitter's or X's artificial intelligence, sort of like ChatGPT, right? So it's a chatbot. And so when I asked Grok this question, it said, here are 10 points related to actions by leaders or associated with the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, commonly known as the Mormon Church, that have been criticized as immoral, unethical, or illegal over the past century. And number one was this: cover up of sexual abuse. And I would add ritual abuse in there. Okay. There have been instances where local church leaders were accused. Sorry, I'll come back to that. There have been instances where local church leaders were accused of not adequately addressing or reporting sexual abuse within their congregations. Okay. Now, I just want to point something out about artificial intelligence because this was like my career is in IT. And I like to kind of knock this whole thing of AI over the head as much as I can because I think people are putting way too much faith in it. And this is a perfect example of why we shouldn't yet place our faith in AI to give us the truth about things. Because generally speaking, I think that Grok is correct that probably the most immoral, unethical, and illegal thing that the church has done is to occult the nature and scope of the sexual abuse and occult abuse or occult crime problem inside of the church. But it's not just local church leaders. And I'm going to show you that today. I'm going to prove it, right? And we proved it on the PACE memo because those weren't local church leaders. Those were global church leaders and corporation leaders who engaged in covering up or not adequately addressing, right, the way that Grok puts it, these sexual abuse crimes, okay? So, but number one on the list of immoral, unethical, and illegal activities in the church is the cover-up of sexual abuse, okay? Okay, let's circle back to 1890 and let's start talking about the rest of the story in terms of how did we get to a place where a church feels like it needs to cover up sexual abuse inside of its organization. So in 1890, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints was in huge financial trouble, especially the leading men inside of the church. You can find documents from general conferences where men like George Q. Cannon talk about the fact that the church and its leaders are so far in debt that they see no way that it will ever be resolved. But in the background, they were working on a plan. And the plan that they came up with was to invest in sugar processing. But instead of cane sugar, they wanted to use beets because you can grow beets in Utah. And so a man by the name of Wilford Woodruff, who was the president of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints at the time, right? So if we look, we're just right before, if we come back here, 1896 is when they do this incorporation scheme. I want people to pay attention that that's 6 years after they come up with this idea of getting in the sugar processing industry, okay? So what Wilford Woodruff said is this: now the inspiration of the Lord to me is to build this factory. Every time I think of abandoning it, there is darkness. And every time I think of building it, there is light. We will build the factory, meaning the sugar factory. We will build the factory if it bursts the church. And this was in 1891, okay? Now, you'll find in later conferences, a man by the name of Heber J. Grant getting up and giving Wilford Woodruff all the credit in the world for starting the sugar processing industry inside of the church, or not inside of the church, but in conjunction with the Church of Jesus Christ, or with the support of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And he'll joke and say, Wilford Woodruff said we were going to do this if it bursts the church, but it didn't burst the church. It's made us millions of dollars. Hardy har har, right? And it's true. It did make the church. I mean, I don't know the number, but I mean, I would venture to guess that over the, 80 years or so that they were really highly involved in this, that it probably made them billions of dollars would be my guess. But that's just me making it just guessing. Okay. What we know is that it's a very strange thing for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints to get involved in the sugar processing industry for this reason. And again, this is religious, so I'm not going to spend a ton of time on it. But inside the church, right, known as the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, there is a revelation called the Word of Wisdom. And the Word of Wisdom is all about how to care for our bodies properly, because as other Christians do, Mormons believe that our bodies are a temple and that we should take care of them. And it's a nutrition guideline given from the Lord himself, according to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Certainly there's nothing in that revelation that would indicate that the church should be producing like the most addictive substance that's like legal, right? That has really terrible effects on human bodies, which is processed sugar. And yet, so we have a revelation telling us how we should do things. And then we have a group of corporate men, right, or about to be corporate men, who do something that I would say is exactly the opposite of what the Word of Wisdom told them to do. And they began processing huge amounts of processed sugar, which has had a really deleterious effect on human health over the last 150 years, right? So again, just kind of weird, right? Like if you're going to get up and say, I should trust you completely, one of the things that I'm going to look at is, what did the revelations tell you should do? And what actions did you take? And in this case, I see a discrepancy there. Now, that's really hard for a lot of church members to take, especially in Idaho and Utah, because a lot of people's families depended on sugar income in order to provide for their family. And so it's very difficult to talk to members of the church about this, because to them, the sugar factory and the sugar industry was a godsend for them, right? So I understand that that's difficult, but I think we need to look at it clear-eyed and with academic or with like intellectual integrity and honesty, right? Here's the big part about this too, that I think people really need to take into account when they think about whether they should trust these 15 men completely. So it got to the point where, and I have a whole presentation about this, like a 2-hour presentation just on the sugar stuff, but like it comes to a point where the government gets concerned because they see the Mormon Church and Mormon leadership involved in what's called the Sugar Trust. So everybody knows about the oil trust. They know about Rockefellers. They know about the Carnegies. They know about the Morgans. What a lot of people don't really know about is that there was a similar organization called the Sugar Trust that had formed a monopoly that the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and its leadership were a part of. And the government gets to a point where they do investigations, and they find the church guilty of conspiring and forming combinations to form and maintain a sugar monopoly. Now, I want people to hold on to that word combining for just 1 second. And then after I read this, I'm going to talk about why that's important inside of a church context. So it says, now, therefore, it is ordered that the respondents, Utah Idaho Sugar Company and the Amalgamated Sugar Company, which are the 2 companies that the church had invested in and funded and staffed and all of that stuff, says, each of them and their officers, agents, and employees, those are going to be your church leaders, shall forever cease and desist from conspiring or combining between and among themselves to, maintain or retain the monopoly of corporation respondents hereinbefore set out, to prevent the establishment of beet sugar enterprises and the building of sugar factories by persons or interests other than said corporation respondents. So this is a finding. This is from a document called the Findings and Orders of the Federal Trade Commission from 1923. Okay. So now here's the thing. The FTC was brand new at this time and they weren't very powerful. And so even though they found that the church and the Sugar Trust had set up this monopoly, that they had formed and were trying to maintain a sugar monopoly by not allowing other companies into the space, the FTC's findings were eventually overruled by more powerful people inside of the government, which shows you how much power the church and the people that it affiliates with and supports have. And so if you talk to a Mormon, they'll say, oh, yeah, sure, the FTC found this, but it was all overruled and overturned later on. Well, yes, which is actually evidence in my favor, I think, right? Because the FTC did all the hard work and came up with the finding only to have somebody above them cross it off the ledger and pretend like none of it was real. And that is the type of organization that you're dealing with the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, which I think people are going to see really clearly after today's presentation. Okay, let's keep moving along. So I heard you mention in the introduction about the conspiracy to overthrow the state of Utah. And I would phrase it slightly. I think you actually read what I wrote you, but I think I've learned a little bit more, and I would slightly modify what I wrote you before. And I don't remember exactly what the wording was that I gave you, but it wasn't to obliterate or eliminate the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. They just wanted to infiltrate and influence the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, right? And since I've given this presentation on, like with my friends, the occult rejects, I've actually learned that I used to have one story about a church leader testifying about the reality of a conspiracy to overthrow Utah. Today, I get to announce that I now have two church leaders, including a church prophet by the name of John Taylor, who speak very openly about the conspiracy to overthrow the state of Utah. So let's look at that. So this is really important because this new witness is not just the church president, it's the entire first presidency. And this was an epistle written to the entire church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and read in general conference. This is as close to scripture as you can possibly get inside of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints without them canonizing it, okay? And it hasn't been canonized, but I mean, it has every piece of criteria that you need to canonize this if people wanted to, because it comes from the very top in an epistle read at general conference, which is the time when you would introduce scripture to the church. And here's what the first presidency says, coming from the journal of George Q. Cannon, who was a counselor in that presidency with John Taylor. It says, the scenes which we are now witnessing in this territory are the results of a deep laid and carefully planned conspiracy, which has been in process of formation for years. Its originators knew the elements they had to deal with. I think that's really interesting language, by the way, elements, because Utah is very mineral rich, right? And so I think there may be a little bit of a play on words here. Might just be me. It says, its originators knew the elements they had to deal with, and by cunning contrivance, they have effected a wonderful combination. So there's that word again. And I want to tell you why that word combination is so important. For those of you who have not joined, who've never had the missionaries over from the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints or joined the church or been a member of the church, the Book of Mormon is the second book of scripture that the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints leans on, right? That entire book, there are two things that are most important in that book. One is that it testifies of Jesus Christ more than any other book on the face of the earth, just numerically, right? It uses the name of Jesus Christ more than any other book. The second thing it testifies about is a group of people who form combinations, or they're called secret combinations. And it's those secret combinations that cause the overthrow of the government and the entire civilization that the Book of Mormon purportedly is reporting on, right? Now, even people like David Bednar, who is an apostle in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, got up in conference, last general conference in October, and said not to worry about whether the Book of Mormon is historical or not. And I agree with Mr. Bednar. We shouldn't really spend our time worrying about that. But I will just say this is a dog whistle. If the first presidency is using the word combination, they are pointing directly back to the Book of Mormon and secret combinations and a group of people called the Gadianton robbers, okay? So what they're saying here, the first presidency is saying, is there's a group of Gadianton robbers, and I know that's a really weird thing, so everybody can just let it go in one ear and one out the other. That's just a group of people who have secret oaths with each other to protect each other from the consequences of their immoral, unethical, and illegal behavior, okay? And so what the first presidency is saying is that there is a group, just like the Gadianton robbers, who have formed a combination and have a conspiracy to overthrow the state of Utah. It goes on to say, religious and irreligious, ministers in sacerdotal robes and atheistic scoffers, businessmen of integrity and blacklegs, temperance men and drunkards, men of strict morality and pimps and harlots are crowded together on the platform they have constructed, and they find no inconvenience from each other's companionship. Each is made to believe that it is to his direct interest to combine to destroy Mormonism. So there's maybe where I got that idea of destroying Mormonism, right? Because certainly the first presidency thought that they were trying to destroy Mormonism. And I would say in a lot of ways that they did, because Russell M. Nelson, the skull and bones prophet, when he became prophet, what did he do? He got up in general conference and said, we should no longer use the word Mormon. That is a victory for Satan. That is fascinating to me, okay? That 100 and something years before, there was a first presidency claiming that there was a group of men, including pimps and harlots, which I think is hilarious. I would love it if Mormon leaders got up and used the word pimp and harlot in general conference today, like they used to in the days before, but we don't anymore because now we're all very nice. Everybody has to be nice, and we're all peacemakers, and we don't use language like this, okay? But it's very fascinating to me that there was the first presidency saying that this was going to happen, and then Russell M. Nelson kind of fulfilled that prophecy and destroyed Mormonism by asking us not to call ourselves Mormons anymore. I think people should take that into consideration, okay? So that's one witness. We're told that in the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses, everything should be established. So here's the other witness. This is John Whitsoe, and John Whitsoe wrote a book called In a Sunlit Land. And in that book, he testifies to the fact that he overheard a group of men at the University of Utah, 2 men who were on the board of regents who are non-members, conspiring to overthrow the state of Utah by diluting the teachings of Mormonism and introducing those diluted teachings to the youth of Mormonism. And so he says in the book, it was actually shocking to hear these men talking about it. And I think we finally have identified those 2 men this week. So because there were only 3 non-members of the church on the board of regents, and one of them was a woman. So if we take John Whitsoe literally and we say, who were the 2 men on the board of regents at the University of Utah at the time that John Whitsoe was president, that was a man, 2 men, one by the name of Bamberger and one by the name of Armstrong. Okay. Now, these are 2 interesting guys. They both come from Germany. The Bamberger family, that family name comes from the Bavaria region, right? Which is a highly occult region of the world. And it's an Ashkenazic Jewish name. Okay. Armstrong comes across from Germany, and he is a banker. And we're going to talk a lot about banking because I think that's one of the major things that caused the overthrow of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and caused it to become more of a corporation than a church. Okay, I'm going to back up here really quickly. I'm going to do this one as fast as I can, but this is interesting to me. So this is from another journal. It's from the Abraham Cannon Journal. Okay, and he says, after meeting, Father was speaking to some of the brethren when he said, with the feelings which President Woodruff entertained towards Moses Thatcher, it would not be wise for any of us to mention this matter to him. Father is George Q. Cannon, okay? Father said Moses Thatcher's drawing away from his brethren commenced as far as his knowledge concerning it went at a time when the Council of 50 met in the old city hall, and Moses opposed the proposition to anoint John Taylor as prophet, priest, and king. And Moses's opposition prevailed at that time. Moses has constantly opposed the increase of power in the hands of the president of the church. So it's important for people to understand that Moses Thatcher is one of the only apostles to ever get excommunicated from the church. And the reason he got excommunicated officially is that he went to go run for office in like Congress or Senate, I can't remember, and he didn't have the permission of the leaders of the church. And so they excommunicated him. Well, why was he trying to gain power? It was because this Council of the 50, which is a very secretive organization, was talking about anointing John Taylor as a prophet, priest, and king. And what's one way to anoint somebody as a prophet, priest, and king? Well, remember, we talked about it earlier. One way to do that is to form a corporation soul, which we know that these guys did. So I would suggest that potentially Moses Thatcher was in the way and that he needed to be excommunicated so that they could form the corporation soul, and they could then have a prophet, priest, and king in the form of a prophet for the church and a king through the corporation. Okay. Now that's a little bit, and I don't expect anybody to be able to kind of like process that immediately, but I would ask that people just kind of sit on that and continue to look at the evidence that I'm going to present and ask yourself whether or not the leader of the church, the leader of the corporation of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints sees himself more as a king than as a CEO, okay, of a 501c3. I think it's a really interesting question. And I'm not even going to propose an answer today, but I think people should think about it, especially when they see their actions, okay? Okay, so we've established that they did the sugar company. We've established that they formed a corporation soul. We've established that contemporaneously, there was a concern about a conspiracy to overthrow the state of Utah through the University of Utah by diluting the teachings of Mormonism and introducing those teachings to students at the University of Utah. So the question to me then is, the scientific question is, was this conspiracy real? And if it was it successful? And I would suggest to everybody watching this presentation that the answer to both of those questions is yes. There was a conspiracy, and yes, it was successful. And here's why I believe that. So it appears to me, using the historical record, that the means of diluting the teachings and then introducing the children to the diluted teachings was using the Greek living system at the University of Utah. And so, of course, for those who don't know, the Greek system is simply fraternities and sororities, right? And it's not like this is like really hard for people to understand. Fraternities and sororities have a reputation. And Emma, I don't know if maybe you were a part of a sorority. And if you were, then by all means, all apologies. I don't think that everybody who joins a fraternity or sorority is a terrible human being, blah, 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 right? I was going to bring it. I forgot to bring it today, but I was actually asked to pledge at Kappa Sigma at the University of Denver. And I chose not to do that, but I was about this close to doing it. And so I don't want to, it's the same thing you said in your intro. I don't want to paint every fraternity brother and every sorority sister as a conspiring, lecherous, horrible human being, but they have a reputation for a reason, right? And that's because over the generations, we've seen a pattern of immoral, unethical, and illegal behavior inside of fraternities. And the University of Utah's fraternities are no different. Just because the fraternity or the sorority is inside of Utah doesn't mean that these are angels who formed a Sigma Chi angel fraternity. No, they're just as bad as any other fraternity or sorority that you've ever seen, okay? So what I see is 4 generations of double-minded men and women, but mostly men, if I'm being honest. The women tend to be the wives of the men who get caught up in the system and then become double-minded themselves. But in general, I'm just going to focus on men. I see 4 generations of double-minded men that bears fruit in the form of Russell M. Nelson becoming the prophet of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and the president of the corporation, also known as the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. So let me show you why I believe that these are double-minded men, okay? So in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, we partake of what's called the sacrament. Like all Christian religions, there's the sacrament of our Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ, right? And it symbolizes the partaking of the flesh and blood of Jesus Christ. And we have that. Well, guess who else has a sacrament? Sigma Chi, which is the fraternity that hundreds and hundreds of LDS men have joined, also has a sacrament as part of the ritual. So this diagram comes directly from the Sigma Chi ritual if you believe that WikiLeaks leaked the right document. I've never heard of WikiLeaks leaking the wrong document and getting sued for leaking the wrong document. So I have a high degree of confidence that this is the actual Sigma Chi ritual, okay? And what you have here is the proper arrangement for what they call the Black Supper. The Black Supper is part of the ritual, and it says here, the Black Supper in the fraternity is a serious and solemn ceremony used as a preliminary introduction to the formal initiation. The primary purpose of this ceremony is to impress candidates with the seriousness of our teachings. It is a lesson in personal responsibility. The ceremony sets the scene for the quest, which is another part of the ritual, and gives the candidate the encouragement of the chapter for the symbolic mission he will undertake. Okay, I hate to even say this, okay, but for those who follow you and also follow Q, they're going to latch on to that symbolic mission because Q is fond of saying symbolism will be their downfall, right? I am not a Q guy. I followed Q very closely for a long time just to get a sense. And I'm very on the record stating that I'm not really like a huge believer that Q is the white hats, right? I look at it more like uh, white squares and black squares on a chessboard. And I see Q as the people playing, well, it just depends on your perspective, right? But for a group of people, they see Q as the white square. The other people see Q as the black square. I just see it as a big game, is what I see it as. And it's a beautiful game. It's incredibly well done, clearly generated by very intelligent people. But I am not here to tell you that Q is the white people. But I think it's interesting that they talk about symbolism being their downfall. And who is it that utilizes symbolism more than anybody else in the world? Well, it's occult secret societies like fraternities, isn't it? Okay. So here are the things that are part of the Black Supper: tables, a chair for each candidate, 2 or 3 candles for the table, goblets and saucers, a black cloth. That's significant because the cloth for the sacrament is supposed to be a white cloth, right? At least in my church, it was a white cloth. Bread and water, those are the same emblems that we partake of in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, our bread and water for our sacrament. And black robes for members. So when I say that these are double-minded men, I just need people to imagine on Saturday night, Russell M. Nelson going to be initiated into Sigma Chi, partaking of the Black Supper in black robes with a black cloth, and then on Sunday, showing up to church and partaking of the sacrament of the Lord's Supper with a white cloth and the same emblems. I cannot think of a better way of describing a double-minded man. I can't think of it. And there's so many of these Mormons who joined organizations like this. And although I only know about Sigma Chi, I imagine that other fraternities have very similar rituals to Sigma Chi and have things like the Black Supper. Okay. Here's another example of why I think that they're double-minded men. This is also from that same document, and it talks about the appearance of Constantine. Okay. It says, the part of Constantine can make or break the entire ceremony. The Constantine part expresses a ritual thesis established by the Crusaders that when a man makes his vows to a credo of an organization and takes an oath of lifelong duration, there must be in that ceremony a recognition that death will ultimately come. This death theme is represented by the scene. The portrayal also contains the admonition that the advice of older men should be heeded. Interesting. That true friendship is timeless. Probably more interesting for you as a woman than for me as a man. Like, I'm going to be an older man, so I want people to heed my advice. But anyway, sorry. Let me start over there again. The portrayal also contains the admonition that the advice of older men should be heeded, that true friendship is timeless, and that the fleeting character of human life makes imperative that we strive to live up to our ideals to the best of our ability. Extreme care must be exercised in the selection of a brother to portray Constantine. Here is one of the truly magnificent roles in the ritualistic world. If there is an undergraduate in your chapter, blah, 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 okay? Here's why this shows double-minded men. In the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, in the official published documents from the church, what you will find is that Constantine is considered a part of what they used to call the Great Apostasy. And the Great Apostasy was like a major teaching in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints up until the last 5 or 10 years, where they've really softened their stance on this. But again, you just have to imagine, let's take another Sigma Chi LDS leader, which would be M. Russell Ballard, who was the president of the Quorum of the 12 Apostles, also a member of Sigma Chi. And you have to imagine M. Russell Ballard considering Constantine a patron saint. Constantine, the man who was responsible for taking things out of the Bible, right, and forming a religion that was really based on the fusion of state and ecclesiastical power. And you have to imagine M. Russell Ballard paying homage to Constantine on a Saturday night and then showing up on a Sunday pretending that he has sole allegiance to Jesus Christ. Okay? Double-minded men and women. 4 generations. That's long enough to do what needed to be done for the overthrow of the University of Utah, the state of Utah, and the infiltration of the church, in my opinion. So one last thing about this, just very quickly, is I think I mentioned in our last show that we're gathering data. And one of the things that we're gathering data on is that fraternity system inside the University of Utah. And it's a big project. And so it takes a lot of time. But this week we completed the work on Skull and Bones and what fraternity, what original fraternity every member of Skull and Bones from 1910 to 1970 was a part of before they became a member of Skull and Bones. And here's what we found. It's very clear that the two most powerful fraternities on the campus of University of Utah are Pi Kappa Alpha and Sigma Chi, or were. I don't know. After 1970, they stopped publishing this data. And so I don't know anymore. But from 1910 to 1970, Pi Kappa Alpha and Sigma Chi basically split the number of pledges to Skull and Bones evenly. Okay. There were a few years where it appears that Sigma Chi was under probation and didn't have the ability to put anybody in Skull and Bones. But if you were to add in the average number that Sigma Chi was putting in on a yearly basis, it would be almost exactly 50-50 in terms of like, not 50-50, but it would be the same number for those two fraternities. And then Beta Theta Pi, Phi Delta Theta, Amici Fidesimi was one of the original fraternities. They're going to be your Pi Kappa Alpha and Sigma Chi guys later on. But we can now start charting and graphing and showing the power structure at the University of Utah as it relates to the Greek system. And what's very clear is that Pi Kappa Alpha and Sigma Chi were the most powerful fraternities. That's only interesting because it just so happens that the most powerful people inside the church hierarchy that joined fraternities are also Pi Kappa Alpha and Sigma Chi members. So it's a direct correlation between who were the ones that were having their teachings diluted and joining these organizations that were doing things that they ought not to be, right? And the ones who ended up in power in positions in business, in government, and then in the ecclesiastical structure. So let me give you a couple other names just to drive this home. John Huntsman was Sigma Chi. Bill Marriott of Marriott Hotels, Sigma Chi. Okay. The Bennett family, Pi Kappa Alpha and Sigma Chi. That's the government side of things, right? Bob Bennett from Watergate, okay, and his dad. But these are the guys that got farmed out. I really do think of it like farming. This is dumb because I'm a Mormon and like we think of everything in terms of farming because we're always taught to plant the seed of faith and all this kind of stuff. But I really think of it this way. These conspirators had a plan. And the plan was to plant seeds in the form of corrupted Mormon men and women and then let that grow and to have a harvest. And I really believe that it happened just like they wanted it to. Okay, where does our evidence come from? Well, it comes from places like the Utonian. The Utonian is the yearbook for the University of Utah. And we went ahead and we looked at every single Utonian that we could get our hands on to gather all of our data, okay? What kind of evidence did we find? Well, we find evidence like this. We find evidence that the Skull and Bones chapter at the University of Utah came directly from Yale, because in the Utonian, it tells us Skull and Bones was founded at Yale University in 1882, and on May 18th, 1909, 11 men of the junior class of the University of Utah became charter members of the society at this school. Okay? Wow. So one of the biggest arguments that people want to have with me is that Skull and Bones at the University of Utah is not the same as Skull and Bones at Yale, but it is. And we know it is because the Utonian told us, and we took the time to look through every single Utonian, okay? What were the fruits of this kind of a thing? Here's another thing that the Utonian is really good at showing us. This is a page from the 1909, right? We just heard that it was 1909 when Skull and Bones showed up at the University of Utah. And here is the 1909 yearbook. And I want you to notice something, okay? You've got your fraternities, and these are the ones that are already there on campus. But I want you to look at the goat, and I want you to look at the numbers, 3, 2, and then it looks like could be a 2, could be a 3, but I just want you to look at the horns. How many horns or how many ears? And what we know is that these guys love their symbolism. And this appears to me to be the announcement that 322, which is the insignia, I guess, of Skull and Bones, has made it onto campus. Okay, 322. Now, there's something really weird and interesting about this. it looks to form a triangle, 322. And there is a document called, I think, the Plimpton tablet or something like that. I can't remember. It's a Babylonian tablet about um, uh, sexageminal, I'm not going to be able to pronounce that right, trigonometry. And I think that one of the reasons that Skull and Bones may have used 322 is that it's part of this Plimpton Babylonian tablet. But anyway, the overall point here is simply this. Skull and Bones makes its way from Yale to the University of Utah, and it shows up in the yearbook, which is one of the best sources that we have. Here's another example. This is the University of Utah, but who do they want to be like? Columbia, Stanford, Harvard, Cornell, and there's Yale. And look who they put right next. In between Columbia and Yale is Utah. And that's true. Columbia, Yale, and Stanford have a high number of Utahns who go to study at those schools. Okay. What kind of people are we dealing with? Well, here's a picture of some fraternity people at the University of Utah. And their sign says IKKK. This is 1970. So I would consider this a little bit after civil rights, but it's still when the church is extremely racist. And we're going to talk about that a little bit more at the end. But these fraternity people are doing things like staging hangings with a sign that says IKKK. So there's some people who want to tell me that, oh, well, 1910 is not the same as 2024. 1910 is not the same as 1940. But I can show you using the historical record that these people don't really change. And what they're doing, their actions don't really change. They're doing the same things in 1910, the same types of things, not the same exact things. Nobody's going to go on campus in 2024 and frame this picture, but they're going to do the same types of things, like show up to interviews in death masks, which they did in like 2020. Skull and Bones members showed up to an interview in death masks and black robes. So it's the same type of people that you're talking about. Okay. All right. The last one here is just kind of it's a fun puzzle for me. And I just want to throw it out there for anybody who wants to try, who likes puzzles and enjoys symbolism. So that interview that I was talking about, where they show up in death masks and black robes, this is the sidebar photo in that article. And I just want everybody to look at this and tell me, is that a human skull?
Wow.
Okay. And I want people to think about this. Donald Trump just won an election, and there's been a really big news story about somebody that he put in a position of power. And I don't know what position of power is, that position of power that is. But I want everybody to look at this. Can you see that inside of the nasal cavity?
Mm-hmm.
So everybody needs to go and look at Donald Trump's Templar Knight guy that he just nominated to a position, and recognize where we are in the history of the United States right now and why he might have a tattoo that looks like this, right? And the skull, this is a modified skull. Okay, look at this up here. That is a crack, that's a skull cap, right? So this skull has been cut open. Okay, the eye sockets are weird. The nose socket is weird. And then I want you to look at this, Emma. Does that look like a human tooth to you? So what are they trying to symbolize here? Okay, I don't know what kind of tooth it is, but what are they trying to symbolize? And then here's the fun one. Like, these guys think they're really clever, and they are. Like, let's give credit where credit is due. They are really, really clever. But I want you to look, and they put it on 2 volumes of the Encyclopedia Britannica. And it just so happens that it's the volume that starts with M-A-L, mal. Do you know what the suffix mal means, Emma? It means evil, bad, right? Like Maleficent from your Disney movies, or malevolent, right? Or to malign. Okay. The other volume starts with S-A-R. And this part of the puzzle, I don't quite understand. I have some sort of interesting hypotheses about it, but I'm not going to go into it because it's a little bit graphic, to be honest with you. But all you have to do is look at the picture that was provided to the newspaper by the Utah Skull and Bone Society to see that they think they're really clever, and they're using symbolism to tell you something if you look closely enough. And I'll let everybody decide what it is that they're trying to tell you, because I got to keep moving here. Yeah, kind of wild, huh?
Yeah.
So, but that's who we're dealing with. And this is Russell M. Nelson. Russell M. Nelson was a part of Skull and Bones, as was another Mormon apostle, Robert D. Hales was a member of Skull and Bones, as were a lot of these like powerful government guys, like the Bennett family. Okay. That's who we're talking about. Running a church, theoretically, but really, I think running a corporation. Okay. All right. Whew. Let me take a deep breath here for a second. This is exciting. One of the major things that I think that we've uncovered that is really that hidden part of Mormon history that nobody really knows about is this piece of Rotary International and the United Nations and the Mormon Church. And again, I have an entire 2-hour presentation on this, but I'm just going to show you what I think are the 3 critical things about this, okay? So Rotary International is an organization that has like the highest degree of respect from the United Nations that you can possibly have. There is like a Rotary International Day at the United Nations every single year. And these 2 organizations are tied at the hip, okay? What we didn't know is that there's a third piece to that that's like a braid, okay? And the third piece of that is Mormons. And what I've proven is that every Mormon leader from the time that Rotary International finds its way into Utah, which is the same time that Skull and Bones is being fired up around 1910 and 1911, prominent Mormon leaders are involved in Rotary International and then later on the United Nations, okay? I'm going to give you 3 examples or three things to look at here for anybody who wants to do deeper research on this. One is very important, okay? Probably the most powerful and influential Mormon to be a part of Rotary International was a man by the name of Mariner S. Eccles. For those who don't know Mariner Eccles, he is considered the father of the modern Federal Reserve, which again is a huge topic of conversation right now, because you've got Elon Musk saying that he's going to bring in Ron Paul for the Department of Governmental Efficiency and get rid of the Federal Reserve, right? Which may or may not be true, but this is like contemporary importance, right? And the person responsible for that Federal Reserve, which a lot of people think really put the United States of America into bondage and slavery, the man responsible for that is Mariner Eccles, who was also a part of the Logan Rotary Club, not just a part of, he was one of the charter members of the Logan Rotary Club. So what I can guarantee you is that when Mariner Eccles threw his name behind the Logan Rotary Club, everybody in Utah who was anybody wanted to be a part of the Rotary Club, because that's where you were going to get access to power, influence, and gain through commerce. Again, kind of a double-minded man thing. You've got a bunch of religious people joining a commerce club, right? God and Mammon comes to mind, okay? And so I really think that these Mormon men were trying to thread a needle that you can't thread. I think they were trying to serve both God and Mammon. And like the scriptures tell us, you can't serve 2 masters. And they ended up serving Mammon, in my opinion, and not God. And a lot of that has to do with Mariner Eccles, okay? I have an entire timeline, like I mentioned, on Rotary International and the United Nations. And we're not going to go through it because it'd take another 2 hours to do it, but I'll come back if you want me to, and we can go through this entire thing, okay? But let's just scroll through it really fast. So you got your Skull and Bones, you've got Rotary Club, you've got the Bamberger influence, you've got your conspiracy, you've got Mariner Eccles, okay? You keep going, and what you'll find is down at the bottom of it, the result of that is, I'm going to talk about this in a second, but what you've got is that Rotary International is tied at the hip with the United Nations, which means that the Mormon Church becomes tied at the hip with the United Nations, through a prophet by the name of David O. McKay. Okay, you have a president of Rotary International from the Mormon Church by the name of Evans, and then you have an endorsement of Rotary International by David O. McKay, where he says the aims of Rotary are compatible with the church. Now, this is really critical if you're a Mormon, because it sets up a really big problem. Because if Rotary International is tied to the United Nations, then there was another prophet by the name of Ezra Taft Benson who was telling you in the name of the Lord that the United Nations was like Satan's plaything. And it was that the United Nations was the organization that Satan was using to get socialism and communism into the United States. So you now have one prophet telling you that the United Nations is like the epitome of evil, and you have another prophet telling you that the aims of Rotary, which are the aims of the United Nations, are like copacetic with the aims of Mormonism. Like, you want to talk about cognitive dissonance, people are going to have to wrestle with this when this history becomes well known. Because which prophet do you listen to? Which prophet was right? And you can see the war going on inside the church office building between what I'll call the Bensonites, and I call them the Nelsonites because Nelson is the latest iteration of the McKay acolytes. Okay. But there has been a, gosh, almost 100-year war going on inside the church office building because of their ties to Rotary International and the United Nations. And on the other side, the Bensonites are tied to organizations like the John Birch Society, which of course is like KKK, basically, right? I might get sued for saying that. I'm not saying that the John Birch Society is the KKK. Lawyers, don't sue me, okay? But it's that type of an organization, okay? So here's the thing that's really fascinating to me, Emma, is that this converges with a man by the name of Marion Nelson, Marion C. Nelson. And who is Marion C. Nelson? Marion Nelson is the father of Russell Marion Nelson. So again, I have almost an entire 2-hour presentation just on Marion, and I don't know how to say his middle name. It's either Claver or Clavar, but I have an entire 2-hour presentation on Marion Clavar Nelson, because he is one of the most important people in Salt Lake in his generation. And it just so happens that he's the father of the man who I believe was placed as the president of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints because of his affiliation with Skull and Bones and Sigma Chi. And his dad was the president of Rotary International in 1944, right around the time that the United Nations comes into existence. That is an awful lot of coincidences, if you ask me. So when we ask ourselves, should we trust these 15 men completely? I think we need to look at how Russell M. Nelson came into power, because I can tell you, using the historical record, Russell M. Nelson was not really anybody like until 1944, when his dad became Rotary International president, at which point Russell M. Nelson's picture is like almost every other picture in the Utonian for the next 2 years. Like, his dad was an advertising executive for a company called Gillum Advertising. And it really looks to me like Marion Nelson's most important product was Russell Nelson. That's a little bit harsh as it comes out of my mouth. But I believe that. I believe that Marion Nelson took his son because Marion Nelson was friends with the Bennett family, with Wallace Bennett, the senator. And I think they may have cooked up a little plan to advertise Russell Marion Nelson as this super righteous, super bright, which he is super bright, no question about that, guy, and started him on a path that eventually led him to become the president of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and the president of the corporation known as the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints as well. Okay. Let me talk very briefly about why that would be important. Marion Nelson was not a member of the church for most of his life, but he joined the church at the end, or maybe he was a member, excuse me, but he wasn't what we would call an active member. He drank, he lived a life, he hired, well, okay, let's not say that. He lived a life that would not be considered in alignment with church teachings for most of his life. So let's say that you are Skull and Bones Bennett and you are Rotary International Nelson, and you need a way to execute on the conspiracy to overthrow Utah, and you happen to have a very bright son by the name of Russell. You know that the church is a sole corporate, right? Corporation sole. And you know, if you know that, because you're in commerce, you know that the person who is the president of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, the corporation, literally is one of the richest people on the face of the earth, because in a corporation sole, all of the assets belong to what they call the incumbent. Okay. So let's just say, for example, that you wanted to build a huge war chest that eventually you wanted to turn over to the United Nations. Well, the best plan I could think of would be to place somebody in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints who has access to all of the assets, that with one stroke of a pen could take all the assets of the church and give it to the United Nations for their one world religion project. Okay. Now, That is a lot of hypothetical that I just spit out of my mouth, not backed by a lot of evidence. Like that's about as conspiracy theory as we're going to get today. But I am saying that the evidence that we do have makes it possible and even probable that that's what happened. So we're up to about the 1940s, 1950s with Marion Clavar Nelson. Then what happens is a man by the name of David M. Kennedy enters the picture. Okay. And here's what I want to show you about David Kennedy and what I consider, what I consider the shadow government that was set up inside the church office building in Salt Lake City. Okay. And I'm going to start with something that I've never talked about before. This is why I believe that the LDS, that the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is better seen as a corporation that has a church attached to it than a church that has a corporation there to protect it in civil matters and criminal matters, like the articles of incorporation of the corporation say it's supposed to be like. So let's read this very quickly. This is an article from Newsweek. It says, between 1960 and early this year, the not-for-profit financial arm of the Mormon Church owned 3,483 acres of federal coal leases in the Manti La Salle National Forest, including the Deer Creek Mine. According to records reviewed by RAND, the Mormon Church subleased the acreage to PacifiCorp, an electric power producer owned by Berkshire Hathaway Energy, that last year alone produced almost 2.1 million tons of coal. In the early 1960s, they, meaning the church, paid $1 an acre for one lease, $25 an acre for the second lease, and $76 an acre for the third lease. The lease sale is a one-time sales transaction from a non-competitive bid, Breach says. Even if you build in inflation, moving the decimal over one, to the right, I would add, this is still a steal in pristine national forests. Part of the argument that we are making for this entire report, not just this one mine in Utah, is that the system is outdated. In 2012, the net worth of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints was estimated at $40 billion. We now know it's way, way, way more than that, okay? But in 2012, that's what they were estimating. As a nonprofit church-affiliated corporation, however, the Mormon Church is unique among the top federal leaseholders for being tax exempt. I'm going to read that again. The Mormon Church is unique among the top federal leaseholders of coal mines and oil fields because they are tax exempt. The researchers were not able to determine what the leases cost more recently, but Breach says, given the market and comparing the church to other companies, it would be fair to say that this business has been lucrative through the decades. The Mormon Church, through a spokesman, of course, declined to comment. And then PacifiCorp decided to close the mine when this became public knowledge, right? So I want you just to imagine, this is something that most people don't know and understand about the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, okay? The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is one of the biggest landholders in the United States. They routinely beat out Bill Gates for land, okay? On that land are things like oil reserves, gas reserves, other mineral reserves, and the church is using that to create incredible amounts of wealth as a tax-exempt organization. That is a sweet deal. Okay, now the question is it moral and ethical? And everybody's going to have to answer that for themselves. I know what I believe, but I'm not going to tell you what to believe, okay? Now, what does David Kennedy have to do with this? Because we were talking about David Kennedy. David Kennedy is one of the most powerful Mormons that nobody knows about, okay? So a little bit of background, David Kennedy was born in Randolph, Utah, but eventually became like the head of the sixth biggest bank in the United States of America, a bank by the name of Continental Illinois. Now, everybody knows the saying too big to fail, and we all think that came into existence in 2008, but it didn't. It came into existence when Continental Illinois failed, and the government decided that Continental Illinois was too big to fail and bailed it out in the 1980s. That's a little bit after David Kennedy was affiliated with the bank, but he's the one who grew the bank to the point where they were able to take the kinds of risks that allowed for the bank failure in the 1980s, where too big to fail became a part of our nomenclature, okay? David Kennedy was also in the Nixon administration, okay? He was the head of the Department of Treasury, okay? He was the Treasury Secretary. That is like one of the three most powerful positions in the United States. And David Kennedy was the Treasury Secretary during the Nixon administration, which gave him access to places like the Bohemian Grove, okay? So you can see here, this is from the CIA reading room, and it says, David M. Kennedy, former chairman of Continental Illinois Bank and Trust Company, then serving as Secretary of the Treasury, was the guest, dot, dot, dot. Okay. And what it's saying is that he was the guest of somebody at Bohemian Grove in 1970, which just so happens to be the year that Ronald Reagan was there too. And by the time Ronald Reagan becomes president, there's a very prominent Mormon who's attached to him by the name of Dick Worthland, who's his pollster. Okay. But you don't understand Dick Worthland unless you understand David M. Kennedy being at Bohemian Grove because of his role as the Treasury Secretary for the Nixon administration. Why is this important for the church office building, Justin? Well, I'm glad you asked. Because what happens is after David Kennedy gets done with his government service, he gets swept up by the church president, Spencer W. Kimball, and he gets asked to play a role in the church, but not of the church. Is that the right way of saying that? I'm not really sure. But let's just read this and I'll tell you what I mean. So it says, though not ordained as a general authority, that would be the normal way to get David Kennedy into the church, right? Into the church hierarchy would be to ordain him as a general authority. That's not what happened with David Kennedy. Instead, they set up a shadow government, and this is how it worked. Kennedy had immediate access to the first presidency, received assignments only from them, and reported only to them. He and Kimball met frequently to examine countries one by one, exploring the possibilities each offered. Kimball advised him to keep the other members of the first presidency updated, but did not stipulate similar briefings for other general authorities. This situation placed Kennedy outside the normal channels of church governance. So when I say that there was a shadow government at the church office building in Salt Lake City, I mean it quite literally. And the head of that government was probably Spencer W. Kimball officially, but the person that he tapped to get it up and going was David M. Kennedy, because David Kennedy, in addition to being the Treasury Secretary, was also the first ambassador to the United Nations for the United States of America. Okay. So you now have a situation where Marion Clavar Nelson has advertised his son and put him on a track to become the president of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, or a powerful person. I don't think you can really predict a person becoming the prophet or the president, but you can certainly predict them becoming a powerful part of the church. So Marion Clavar Nelson does his advertising. He gets everybody to think about Russell Nelson, and that's baking in the oven. At the same time, Spencer W. Kimball, who met with the Khashoggi family, okay, do I have that on here? I don't. You know what? I'm going to take a second. I'm going to do one little sidebar here, because this is important. Because when you start talking about David M. Kennedy, you're also talking about the Central Intelligence Agency, okay? Mm. So David M. Kennedy was friends with a man by the name of Michael Sindona, and Sindona is known as God's banker. The reason he was known as God's banker is that he was the interface between the CIA, Opus Dei, which is a Vatican organization, right? And so he was laundering money and eventually ended up in jail. Okay. He was also a good friend of David M. Kennedy, who had he was a stakeholder in a Sindona bank, which I'm going to talk about in a little bit. But here's what I want people to understand. When we're talking about Spencer W. Kimball bringing Kennedy into the church office building to set up a shadow government, here's what's also happening. On Wednesday, June 8th, 1977, Spencer W. Kimball wrote in his journal, and you cannot find this in his journal anymore because church historians stripped it out of the official record in order to whitewash history. But we caught it before they did that, and I have a copy of it. And here's what it says. Held a meeting of the first presidency at 8 o'clock this morning. At 9:45 a.m., I excused myself from the meeting and met with a Dr. Mohammed Khashoggi and members of his family from Saudi Arabia, who are here for the dedication of the new international center that is being erected out west of the Salt Lake City airport. Well, who is the Khashoggi family? Okay. The Khashoggi family is this guy. Okay. And what I'm proposing is that the Godhead of the shadow government set up in the church office building in Salt Lake City are people like the Central Intelligence Agency, Adnan Khashoggi, and a company called Triad America. Now, I don't have time to go through all this, okay? But I just want to point out that we have the Kimball Khashoggi meeting that I just showed you. We know that Kennedy was involved with Triad America because I found the newspaper clipping where David M. Kennedy is going to be the speaker, where it's being sponsored by Mobil Oil Company Corporation and Triad America. So we know that Kennedy knows all about what's going on with the Khashoggi family, the CIA Khashoggi family. Okay. We also know that the Mormon Church was willing to let them build this Triad Center blocks away from the church office building, and it was going to dwarf the church office building. Except Khashoggi fleeced Salt Lake City and the leaders of the church, and he skipped town. And the church ended up having to buy this real estate after investing in Khashoggi, allowing Khashoggi to quote unquote invest in Salt Lake City for the betterment of the city. Okay. But it's all one big happy family. CIA, Khashoggi's, Russian assets. Okay. Kimball. Did I already say Kennedy? I think I did. Okay. And then you're going to pull in people like Bruce Lindsay. I think that's his name, Bruce Lindsay, who's the father-in-law of Council on Foreign Relations Apostle Garrett Gong, who, surprise, surprise, was making $260,000 a year as a member of a board of directors of a oil company, despite having no experience in the oil industry, although he did have access to some countries that an oil company would want. Okay. So anyway, the whole point there is simply that David M. Kennedy, Gordon Bowen, Beverly Campbell, Ralph Hardy, Bob Barker, Donald Ladd, okay? This is the shadow government. And they're based out of Washington, D.C., but they're working with David Kennedy in Salt Lake City, through Salt Lake City, to set up a shadow government because they feel like the church isn't progressing as fast as it needs to. So they decide to play the role of God, okay? And to the point where they name their city Mount Olympus, which we're going to talk about in a second. All right, we're going to keep moving. I'm going to go pretty fast on this part because we already talked about CIA, right? So I have a whole timeline for this that I could come back and we could spend 2 hours talking about the church's involvement with the CIA and IBM and so on and so forth. But let's just talk very quickly about Beverly Campbell, Sergeant Shriver, and who I call the international man of mystery, Arwell Pierce Campbell, who was the husband of Beverly Campbell. Okay, but what I want to point out is that this is from 1984, which is the same year that the church endorsed the mission of the CIA. And in her record, Beverly Campbell writes, "We at last came to the understanding that what was important was setting ourselves on some sort of a career track and that the rest would unfold. Pierce interviewed with several companies and settled on a position with an international corporation named Dyne Electron. I explored a few options and then was approached by the director of the Kennedy Foundation." Okay, so here you have a major power couple inside the church, Arwell Pierce Campbell and Beverly Bruff Campbell. Beverly Bruff Campbell ends up working for the Kennedy Foundation, of all places. And Arwell Pierce Campbell ends up working for a company called Dyne Electron, which it just so happens is a CIA cutout that has been charged with human trafficking. Beverly and Arwell purchased land that backed up to Langley. They built a huge house and called it the Embassy. And they brought ambassadors and other really prominent people over to the embassy over and over and over and over again during their time in Washington, D.C. Okay. So once you get this shadow government set up, I am going to propose that Arwell Pierce Campbell is probably one of your CIA agents inside that shadow government. And we have a FOIA request to find out, but I don't know if they'll tell us, even if we're right. Okay. But everything about Arwell Pierce Campbell screams CIA asset. Okay. So that's part of this. So again, January 84, Beverly Campbell is talking about the jobs that she and Arwell took. Oh, one other really important thing about Arwell Pierce Campbell and Beverly Campbell. Remember that the Khashoggis are Saudi Arabian? In her book, she talks about being in Virginia and trying to purchase land in Virginia using our Saudi Arabian investors' money. So I can't prove that that's Khashoggi money, but I'd be willing to bet that that's Khashoggi money that Beverly Campbell and Arwell Pierce Campbell are utilizing, trying to buy land in Virginia. I haven't found any transactions where they were successful yet, but we're going to keep looking and I'll let you know if we find any. Okay. So January 84, they're doing this. In February 84, we talked about in our last interview how the church endorses the mission of the CIA. It just says that despite their concerns about the possible undercutting of the church's image, leaders, elders of the church, meaning the top men in the church, endorse the mission of the CIA, and it's official. Like they'd been supporting the CIA for a very long time in lots of different ways. But now in 1984, while Jeffrey R. Holland is the president of Brigham Young University, there's a meeting at BYU, and they are formally endorsing that mission. Jeffrey Holland is now an apostle of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, of course. And guess who dedicated the David M. Kennedy International Center at BYU? Jeffrey R. Holland was the one who did that. Okay. So it's all one big happy family, isn't it? Emma, I'm going to ask you actually, this section here is probably the least important section. Do you think that I should skip over it or should I go through it? It's kind of just more on what we've already talked about. And I am dragging a lot slower than I thought I was. Should I just skip this part?
I would almost say let's go through it. And if we need to do kind of a part two of this part two, we can do it. I think
Okay.
tying some of these details in that you're doing, it's really helping illustrate how these networks work and how far they extend into government, into these churches, into the CIA, and all these different branches and institutions. And you really start to see how this one or two people or a couple people can infiltrate an entire government or an entire religious institution. So I think what
Yeah.
you're doing is helping paint a bigger picture.
Okay. Well, let's do it then.
Okay.
And I apologize for moving a little bit slower than I thought I was going
No,
to.
this is so good. These details are really important. Don't apologize.
All right. So we're going to talk some more about Beverly Campbell then. And what's really important about Beverly Campbell is that she is on a committee inside of the church shadow government called the Special Affairs Committee. And Beverly Campbell talks very openly about this Special Affairs Committee and how they don't have any agendas for their meeting and they don't take any notes about what they talked about. And these are the issues that are the most important, that they don't get publicity. Okay. And so basically, it's a PR, it's a group of people like lawyers, PR people, and those kinds of folks who are going to take things that the church doesn't want known wide and far, and they're going to be the ones who are the fixers inside of the church. Okay. So Beverly Campbell names some of these people. So she talks about Robert Barker right there in the middle. Okay. Now, Robert Barker is somebody that I have not actually. Robert Barker is extremely interesting, and I need to do a deep dive on Robert Barker because I bet I'll come up with a 2-hour presentation just on him. But he was an extremely powerful and influential lawyer in Washington, D.C. And at first, I thought that Beverly Campbell was calling herself the 13th apostle. And I still want to hold on to that. But if I'm really looking at it, I think what she's saying here is that Robert Barker considered himself the 13th apostle. And he's the one that pulled her out and brought her into the Special Affairs Committee and put her inside of the church office building. So for right now, I need people just to put a pin in Robert Barker, and I'll come back and I'll talk about him another time after I've had a chance to do a deep dive on him. What we know is that he served with like Patton or something like that in World War II, and then went on to this incredible career as an incredibly powerful, prominent lawyer inside Washington, D.C., who was able to keep his name out of the newspapers, which is very, very hard to do. And so, but this is one of the most influential people in Beverly Campbell's life and the person who brings her in to the shadow government there at the church office building. Okay. This next piece is about that Special Affairs Committee, and I call it special people doing special things. And this is what I would consider the work of the deep church, right? The deep state. It's just a play on words. It's not really the deep church. It's just a play on words. But here's what she says. At my first meeting in the offices of Richard Lindsay, okay, Richard Lindsay, that's who it is. I think I said Bruce, but it's Richard Lindsay. That's Garrett Gong's father-in-law, okay? So at my first meeting in the offices of Richard Lindsay, who supervised the Special Affairs Office at church headquarters for the 12, I received a call from Elder James E. Faust. Remember that name from the Pace memo? That's James Esdras Faust, okay? So she receives a call from James E. Faust requesting that I drop by his office. I also received calls from Elder David B. Haight. Okay. Now I'm an abuse researcher, and David B. Haight is a name that comes up a lot in abuse cases. This one in particular that I'm not going to name right now. But David B. Haight is an occult secret society member whose name comes up in abuse cases, and he's a part of the Special Affairs Committee. Dallin H. Oaks, who's going to be the next president of the church. Okay. Not a cult secret society necessarily, but secret society. He was a part of a group called the Gold Brickers. Okay. And from Wendell Ashton, big time occult secret society guy. Okay. Editor of the Deseret News, so helping out with the propaganda arm of the church, each asking if I could meet with them. Elder Lindsay was surprised that they all knew me and would ask that I come to their offices. I was not surprised, but a little intimidated. So when you get somebody like Bob Barker, who plucks out a Beverly Campbell and puts her inside the church office building, she now has access to every important person inside the ecclesiastical structure of the church known as the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, in order to do the work of the corporation, also known as the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. It's very important to note that Beverly Campbell was never an employee of the church. She was a general contractor for the corporation known as the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, but had access to everybody inside the church anytime she wanted. In fact, they were kind of desperate to have access to her. And that gives you a little bit of sense of the power imbalance between the corporation and the church as it's shifting and slipping away from the church being powerful to this parasite corporation sucking the lifeblood out of the church. And it's shifting, shifting, shifting. By the time you get Beverly Campbell, the corporation is really sucked the life out of the corporation, or excuse me, out of the church. I apologize. Okay. One of the really important things about Beverly Campbell's record is that she shows very clearly that there's a battle going on between the Bensonites, okay, and the United Nations crowd, because she writes a memo to Elder Worthlin, who is the relative of Dick Worthlin, who's in the Reagan administration. And she talks about having an ambassador at Brigham Young University. And as part of that, she says, she enumerates what she told this Chinese ambassador, and what they told this Chinese ambassador at Brigham University. One of the things that they tell them is our desire to ensure that the United Nations is a truly viable, legitimate force in international politics. Now, this is while President Benson is either still alive or just very recently dead, and is over the pulpit telling people that the United Nations is a tool of the adversary. Okay. So there is a very real controversy inside the church office building in the 1980s that nobody has explored historically that I'm aware of. And it all has to do with Rotary International, United Nations, excuse me, the Bensonites, and then these McKay people who believe that the United Nations should be a viable, legitimate force in international politics. Okay, that's the hidden Mormon history that I just don't think anybody has ever really explored. Okay, now we get to the part where I explain why it becomes so important for the church to make sure that no abuse scandal ever hits like major awareness outside of the church. So you can imagine if you have corporate power and you have a shadow government, so you have government power set up at the church office building, and it's working really well. The church's membership numbers are growing. The church's financial coffers are exploding, right? The church is gaining power and influence and gaining favor in the eyes of the Central Intelligence Agency and Lockheed Martin and Boeing and nuclear power people. And like, it's working. Wow. Like, we're so smart. Us special affairs people are so smart. It's working. But then all of a sudden, there's a bunch of abuse scandals that start seeping up through the bottom, because the type of people who are running the corporation are also the type of people who abuse people. And now all of a sudden you have billions of dollars of assets that you have to protect. You have land and buildings. Most importantly is that you're getting this all as a tax-exempt organization. And the only reason you're getting it as a tax-exempt organization is you have a church as a beard. And if it starts coming out that there's abuse inside of that church, and the government decides that you're not doing your job of making sure that the people in the church are safe, and they take away your tax exempt status, the grift is over. So it becomes critical. Like, it's like, because it has to be one of the top priorities to make sure that none of these abuse scandals like the Pace memo ever gets any traction. And so they spin up a propaganda arm. Well, they already have it, but they really put it on steroids, right? Propaganda and also intelligence. So like spying on members through that strengthening the church members committee that we talked about in our other interview. Okay. And it's all to protect the image and assets of the corporation, because it's working. everything's working. And it would be the worst thing ever to find out that the church has an abuse scandal, an occult crime scandal, and people stopped joining the church. And then the government started looking at us and saying, wait, that's happening inside of your buildings. Why are you guys so focused on coal leases and so little on abuse victims? Hey, you're not a 501c3, are you? Ruh-roh, right? Like that's a big problem. Okay, so let's talk about some of the abuse scandals that were happening that they needed to cover up. So I mentioned that these guys kind of think that they're gods. And one of the ways that you can see that they think that they're gods is that they named the town in Utah where they all live Mount Olympus, which is the home of the Greek gods. So you can kind of see the psychology of these guys. They're building cities, and then their streets are called Athens Way and Jupiter Drive. And it's all the Greek gods, right? And that's sort of how they see themselves as these Greek gods inside of Utah, right? In the Greek organizations, the fraternities. The problem is Mount Olympus and the entire East Bench is one of the most disgusting places on the face of the earth for abuse. Okay. And there's a book called Paper Dolls, okay, that talks about some of the abuse that was going on. And when April Daniels is the pseudonym of the woman who wrote Paper Dolls, when she wrote this book, she didn't realize what she was writing necessarily. But she came out just very recently, like within the last 2 years, and she kind of expounded on who some of these people were. And I'm going to tell you who 3 of the worst abusers in Mount Olympus, Utah were. Okay. So one of them was Brian David Mitchell. And if you don't recognize that name, you just need to look up Elizabeth Smart, because Brian David Mitchell is the man who abducted Elizabeth Smart. But long before he abducted Elizabeth Smart, he was abusing youth in Mount Olympus, Utah, at Highland and East High School, and the church never disciplined him for the abuse that he perpetrated in Mount Olympus. That's one. Okay. Number 2 is a guy by the name of David Fuller. And that's one that most people don't know. I didn't know about it until I kind of got in with this group with April Daniels and some of her friends. But David Fuller murdered a girl by the name of Casey Woody by luring her online, right? And then asking to meet her in person, taking her to a storage facility and murdering her, and then committing suicide. But before David Fuller was the murderer of Casey Woody, he was an abuser in Mount Olympus, Utah, who wasn't punished for his sins and crimes of abuse in Mount Olympus, Utah, which allowed him to go through the years and then murder Casey Woody. Okay. The third one is Bill Karstensen. And we talked a little bit about Bill Karstensen in our other episode, but Bill Karstensen is an extremely important story. And while I tell that story, I actually want to come back up here because this story has to do with Russell Marion Nelson. And I'm gonna take some time. And I know that I'm going slow, but I really want to drive home the importance of what happened here, because now I've laid the context for people in a way that I never really have. Bill Karstensen was also abusing people in Mount Olympus, Utah in the late 1960s and early 1970s. He then went to the University of Utah and married into a very prominent Skull and Bones family called the Smiths, okay? It turns out that Bill Karstensen is a diagnosed pedophile and he abuses a lot of the Smith children, okay? The mother finds out and the grandmother finds out, and the grandmother is extremely powerful. In fact, the person who married Russell Marion Nelson was the grandfather of the Smith family. Okay. So this is all kind of like this weird, like situation where it's like a Skull and Bones. It's like mob warfare that happens because Bill Karstensen, the diagnosed pedophile, gets inside of one Skull and Bones family, and he's best friends with Russell Marion Nelson's daughter, Brenda Miles, and her husband, Dick Miles. Okay. So you have a Skull and Bones family with children who are being abused by a Skull and Bones family who had a diagnosed pedophile marry into the family and slip his way in. And that's a big problem. And you end up with a huge, huge issue in Bountiful, Utah. Okay. The long and short of it is Bill Karstensen and Dick and Brenda Miles end up getting off the hook in Bountiful, Utah, because Russell Marion Nelson, as an apostle of the Lord Jesus Christ in 1986, he was called it in 1984. In 1986, He intervenes in the disciplinary process with the son of a Skull and Bones man who is the stake president in Bountiful, Utah, and tells him, you are not to punish these people. Okay. There's also a blessing given, okay, a priesthood blessing. And for people who aren't members of the church, that may not be a big thing. But for people who are members of the church, they'll understand that that priesthood blessing is considered revelation directly to Bill Carstensen, in which Bill Carstensen is told that his abuse has been sealed, like that the heavens have been sealed, and he'll never be held accountable for the abuse that he perpetrated by an apostle of the Lord. Okay, this is in court documents. So Russell Nelson intervenes, and the problem goes away for about 20 years. Okay. But in 2018, a man by the name of David Eccles Hardy steps forward and tells his story. And his story is this. His brother is Ralph Hardy Jr., who's a part of the Special Affairs Committee. He is one of the fixers in the shadow government there in Salt Lake City at the church office building, except that he's based out of Washington, D.C., because he's yet another prominent Washington, D.C. lawyer who's fixing problems for the church. David Eccles Hardy is a lawyer in Salt Lake City and gets a call from his brother and says, look, I have a problem. I'm going to send you a fax, and I need you to walk it over and hand deliver the fax to Russell Marion Nelson. So David Eccles Hardy agrees to do that. And when the fax comes across, he reads it, and it says, Dear President Nelson, or Dear Brother Nelson, Dear Elder Nelson, I'm so sorry for this tragedy which has befallen your family. We must make sure that this never makes it into the public eye. So it's abuse cover-up instructions from Ralph Hardy to Russell Nelson in 1986. And in 2018, David Eccles Hardy signs under the penalty of perjury some court documents, and they sue Brenda Miles and Dick Miles for their part in the abuse perpetrated by diagnosed pedophile Bill Carstensen and allegedly Dick and Brenda Miles. Well, you can only imagine that the Special Affairs Committee has to kick into full gear in order to make sure that this does not happen, because here's the problem. Because Russell Nelson interfered in an investigation and in local discipline, he's now the president of the church in 2018. And because he's the president of the corporation Soul, what did we just talk about? He is one of the richest people on the face of the earth because all the assets of the church belong to Russell Nelson. And he is personally liable for some of the abuse that took place in Bountiful, Utah, after he stepped in. And the lawyers who are involved in this case are going to depose Russell Nelson, establish that he interfered in this investigation, and then they're going to try to get at the church's assets. That's a lot of assets, and there was a lot of abuse. So this is like a 5-alarm fire. Let me tell you how important this is to the church, okay? David Eccles Hardy takes his story to the Washington Post. They say that they want it. He waits a couple weeks and they never get back to him. And all of a sudden he gets back to them and they say, oh yeah, we've been told that we cannot cover this story. So he takes the story to the New York Times. The New York Times says, yes, we want this story. He travels to New York to tell the story. While he's there, he gets a phone call from his brother. And his brother says, is this you? I'm hearing that the New York Times is going to tell this story. And David says, yes, it's me. And Ralph says, what are we going to do? Like I do. And David Eccles Hardy tells me that he has never heard his brother sound scared, except for that day when David Eccles Hardy was in New York telling his story to the New York Times and Vice News. But guess what happens? Within 72 hours of getting a call from Ralph Hardy Jr., the New York Times and Vice both come back to David and say, we are not going to cover this story. We have been told that we are not allowed to cover this story. Okay. And I have the press passes that prove that David Eccles Hardy was there. Okay. I have pictures of the press passes that prove that David Eccles Hardy was there. So again, people, when you get abused and you go to the church for help, you think you're going to this local little group of people who are going to love on you and give you support. No, you are dealing with some of the most powerful people in this country and in the world. People who can kill. Stories about diagnosed pedophiles and church leaders covering up abuse. They can use the New York Times like a puppet if they want to. They can use the Washington Post like a puppet if they want to. And they do want to sometimes, and they do it. That's why I say, do never take your abuse story to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, ever. Because if it's truly a bad one, they are going to utilize every tool and every piece of leverage at their disposal to make sure that your story never finds the light of day. Okay. Let me tell you how important this story is. Okay. I'm going to skip over the PACE document for 1 second. I'm going to skip over my story. I'm going to skip over this because here's what I mean. That 2018 lawsuit was about a man by the name of Justin William Hoyman. Okay. Now, here's something important to understand. Bill Carstensen, his name was William Joseph Carstensen. And Justin William Hoyman, his birth name was actually Justin William Carstensen. Okay. So they changed his name because his dad abused him. And then his mom got married to a nicer man by the last name of Hoyman. And so they changed his name to sort of put that in the past. But of course, when you're sexually abused, you can't really put it in. Well, you can, but it's extremely difficult to put it in the past. And when a church is covering it up, it's even harder to put it in the past. And Justin was not able to really put it in his past, unfortunately. And he got involved in some painkillers and some bad situations. And he ended up having to go to jail. And then eventually he was in a halfway house. And in 2017, he disappeared off the face of the earth from Salt Lake City at a time when he was theoretically in a halfway house talking about his past, including the abuse potentially at the hands of his father, William Joseph Carstensen, or Bill Carstensen, the man who Russell M. Nelson ensured had access to Justin Hoyman, right? And dozens of other children, from what I hear. But that story, that has to be one of the biggest abuse stories out there. But can you get news coverage on it? You cannot. And I've tried everything I know how. And David Hardy has tried everything he knows how. And the family has tried everything they know how. You cannot do it. You just can't, because the church is that powerful and this story is that explosive. We talked a ton about the PACE document. I would just encourage everybody, if you want to learn more about that, go see part 1 of this. But the very short version of this is that there is definitely ritual abuse and occult crime that happens inside the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And we know that because of a leaked document that was requested by the Strengthening the Church Members Committee inside the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. So nobody can tell you that there is not occult crime, Satanism, and ritual abuse inside the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, because their presiding bishopric and their social services department and Brent Ward all tell us that there is a problem with that, but they covered it up. They covered it up. So now we've got 2 major scandals that they've covered up, right? Things that could literally bring the church to its knees as a 501c3, not the church, but it would bring the corporation to its knees if those 2 scandals got the coverage that they deserved, wouldn't it? Okay. So, but that's all I'm going to say about that today. You can go see part 1. We did 2 hours on that whole thing. I'm going to go very quickly. So my full name is Justin Woolsey Riggs. And one of the most surprising parts of my research was when I realized that there was a major problem with abuse inside of my extended family. So my great uncle was Heber Grant Woolsey, and Heber Grant Woolsey was a public relations and media guy who got pulled into the church office building in the late 1970s and early 1980s. And he was responsible for some of the church's most popular advertisements and specials that were related to the family. So like the Homefront series and ads that were like, isn't it about time? Talking about spending time with your family. Well, it turns out that there's a real backstory to this. And unfortunately, there was a ton of abuse going on, or there are claims of a ton of abuse going on inside of the Heber Grant Woolsey family, okay? Including accusations against both Heber and his wife, Faye, accusations against his son, Grant Alma Woolsey, who definitely had a very difficult life and has like a rap sheet that's just longer than we could go through. There's allegations of that. Then there are allegations against some of the sisters. There were 8 daughters, I believe, in that family. There are allegations of abuse against some of the daughters, but those allegations are from the grandchildren. So we're talking, not to mention that Heber's wife, Faye, apparently was abused by her relatives in Canada. So you're talking 4 generations of abuse at this point that have been covered up because Here's the problem. Heber Woolsey's entire career was about building the image of families can be together forever and we should have perfect families. And one of his daughters, whose name is Janine Woolsey Badsgard, spent her entire career as the Irma Bombeck of Mormonism, telling everybody how to have perfect families. But she's one of the daughters who has abuse allegations out against her. So it appears that there was a whole lot of making things up in the Woolsey family in order to help the corporation keep the brand going, while privately there were major abuse problems inside of these families. And of course, I mean, that's heartbreaking for me because those are my people. Like, that is my name, right? And I didn't know any of these people growing up, but I know some of them now. And I can tell you, it is the hardest case that I've looked at in order to determine what's true and what's not true, because the number and type of allegations it's just like a mushroom cloud. It just seems to never end. But like, what's very clear is that there is a huge abuse problem inside of my extended family. And that's hard. That hurts. But one of the reasons I do this research is that I don't want my children to perpetuate patterns inside of our family that have led to these kinds of situations, because our children deserve better, don't they? And that's why we're here, theoretically, is to build a world that's better for our children. So maybe we should stop covering up abuse, and maybe we should just start talking about it openly, because secrets make you sick, but sunlight is the best disinfectant, right? Now I sound like an advertising guy. Sorry about that. I didn't mean to like throw out all my mottos all at once. But like, can we stop, everybody? Like, dear Mormons, can we stop pretending that our families are perfect, like my great uncle Heber and his daughter Janine did? And can we just acknowledge the reality of the epidemic of abuse inside of our families so that we can heal our families, so that our children can have a better life than the ones that we had? I would really appreciate it if we could do that. And I would love for you to join me in trying to tear my research apart and showing me where I'm wrong. Because if I'm not wrong, then we have to do this. There's no other way out. But if I am wrong, then it deserves to be destroyed. The problem is I can't get them even to talk to me right now because their cultural conditioning is so strong, and the PR arm and that intelligence arm of the church is so strong that I can't even get this out to the general Mormon population to even try to tear it down. Anyway, that's neither here nor there. That's my soapbox moment for this interview. So, but it means a lot to me because it's my family, right? This is why I have to understand what happened. I have to. I can't stop until I understand. All right. So, in order to make sure that none of this gets out, the church formulates an abuse prevention and response strategy. Unfortunately, it has to be one of the biggest faux pas in the history of 501c3s, because what the church ends up doing in terms of their abuse response strategy is they start a hotline that all the church members think is for abuse victims. But anytime an abuse victim gets involved, what they learn very quickly is that it's not for victims. It's to protect the image and assets of the church by putting you in touch with a lawyer, not the victim. The victim doesn't get to talk to the hotline. The representatives of the church get to talk to the lawyers of the corporation so that the corporation can begin to formulate a legal strategy to protect the image and assets of the church if that abuse happened in a way that would allow the church to be held, not the church, the corporation to be held liable, or the church actually, either the corporation or the church to be held liable. So at first this works because nobody understands what it is. But the further we get away from establishing that abuse hotline, the more people see exactly what it is, which is nothing to do with helping victims and everything to do with protecting the image and assets of the church. So pardon me. So you now have a corporation that has billions, if not a trillion or trillions of dollars of assets, okay, that has to cover up abuse in order to make sure that they can have their tax-exempt status and their 501c3 status held together. And the way they do that is to harm the most vulnerable parts of their population, which is abuse victims. This is going to go down in history. Like, I don't predict things very often, But I'm going to go on the record, Emma, today, and I'm going to predict this is going to go down as one of the most consequential decisions that any group of Mormon leaders ever made. And it's going to go down as one of the worst decisions ever. Worse than withholding the priesthood from blacks, right? Or African Americans, okay? Worse than Ensign Peak and creating shell companies. This decision to make this hotline and to harm the most vulnerable people in their flock so that they could save a little bit of money and save their 501c3 status, in the eternal scheme of things, is going to go down as one of the worst decisions ever made inside the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. I'll put my name on that statement right now, and we'll just have to see what happens, okay? The thing that really bothers me about this is at the same time that they're doing this, they trot out Russell Nelson to give a talk, or they probably don't trot him out. He probably chooses to do this because by this time he is the president and prophet. So he chooses to come out and give a talk in 2022 on abuse. And here's what he says. Abuse constitutes the influence of the adversary and is a grievous sin. Let me be perfectly clear. Any kind of abuse of women, children, or anyone is an abomination to the Lord. That's the strongest language you can use in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. It is an abomination to the Lord. He mourns, and we all mourn, for each person who has fallen victim to abuse of any kind. Man, I feel like cursing right now. Can I curse on your show? Is that okay? Well, here I'm going to curse then. Well, damn it, Russell. Then why are you covering up for diagnosed pedophile Bill Carstensen when some of the children that he abused are your own grandchildren? Like, you want to work up the fires inside of Justin Riggs? You cover up the abuse of a diagnosed pedophile who abused your own grandchildren, and then you get up in front of a worldwide audience and you claim that any abuse is an abomination and that you mourn? Well, you know what? It's not enough to mourn, Russell. You have to hold people accountable for the crimes that they commit. It's not just a sin when somebody gets abused. It's a crime. And you did not have the right to stick your nose in that case with Bill Carstensen and make sure that he wasn't punished for his crimes or his sins. And you need to make it right. He's 100 years old. He's not going to be around much longer. He doesn't have much time left on this earth. But Russell Nelson needs to make this right. He needs to come out and tell the truth about what he did and work to help find Justin Hoyman, and also put abuse prevention and response strategies in place that are for the victims, not for the image and assets of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, the corporation. It is time for us to grow up and quit pretending that we are the gods of Mount Olympus and start being real men and women and taking care of the most vulnerable amongst us, if I do say so myself. I don't know if it's going to happen because it would end Russell Nelson's legacy. And Russell Nelson is a very fulsome man, according to Edward Kimball, President Kimball's son. And fulsome just means that the chances of him telling the truth about this are almost zero. But there is a chance, and I want to give him that chance. So Russell, let's do it, okay? Come out and tell the truth about what you did in 1986. Tell the truth about your Skull and Bones lawyer in 2018, and help us find Justin Hoyman, and help us put together some abuse prevention and response strategies that aid the victims, not your stupid and silly corporation. My mom's going to be so mad that I cussed. What do I do? Just kidding.
Sometimes it needs it.
All right. To end, we've talked about a lot of immoral and unethical things. Let's just talk about, we started with an illegal thing, which is the sugar trust. Let's end with some illegal things as well, just so that nobody says, well, you talked about immoral and unethical things, but you didn't talk about anything illegal. Okay, well, fine. Let's talk about some illegal things too, okay? So to understand what happened here, you need to understand a little bit of Mormon scripture. This is from the Doctrine and Covenants, section 120. It says, verily, thus saith the Lord, the time is now come that it shall be disposed of, it being the tithing of the church, because section 119 is about tithing, okay? So that the tithing shall be disposed of by a council composed of the first presidency of my church and of the bishop and his council, and by my high council, and by mine own voice unto them, saith the Lord, even so, amen. Okay, So the idea here is that the Lord himself, according to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, in their constitution, the Doctrine and Covenants is the constitution of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, has instructed them how to dispose of the church's tithing. And the way that you do that is by the Lord's own voice unto these councils. Okay? So here's what happened with the church's tithing money in reality. Okay? So the church admitted that from 1997 to 2022, they engaged in a series of illegal behaviors where they took the tithing money and invested it into securities and other things in order to grow the funds of the church. The way that they did that was by setting up shell companies and then using people with names that would not be easily recognized as members of the church. They had people signing documents that they had never seen. They would send them, they would fax them the back copy of a legal document and say, please sign this. And the document is attesting to the fact that everything in that document is true. So it's a false attestation, which is illegal. Okay. And they're engaging in all this illegal behavior, including these two things that I pulled out. So this is from the document that anybody can go pull up. It's an SEC document, okay, that announced the fines and the findings of the SEC investigation against the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Now, I will admit that I don't know if the SEC even knows the difference between the church known as the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and the corporation known as the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. But somebody at the SEC should really learn about this. They write as though it's the church. But I really wonder if they were to parse this a little bit more and understand the difference, how much of it would be the church's responsibility and how much of it would be the 501c3's responsibility. Okay, that corporation sold. But here's what they said. It's under the heading facts. Okay, this is their document. That's not me saying facts. This is what the SEC and the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints agreed are the facts, some of the facts. It says, the church created Ensign Peak in 1997 as an integrated auxiliary of the church, okay, which I don't believe that. I think it's the corporation, okay? That's just me. To manage the church's investment securities, Ensign Peak has no shareholders or members. The securities portfolio managed by Ensign Peak consists of what the church calls quote unquote reserve funds or quote unquote reserves, which include U.S. equity and debt securities purchased with excess tithing. Now, I got to stop here because I think there are so few people in the world who understand what happened here. Because if you don't understand that D&C 120 said that the disposition of tithes, the disposing of tithes, needed to be done by the mouth of the Lord, then you don't understand what I just read, because what they were doing with the tithing was purchasing U.S. equity and debt securities. And if they were following the constitution of the church, that means that Jesus Christ was telling them to take excess tithing and dispose of it by purchasing equity and debt securities. And that has to be one of the most ludicrous things I've ever heard in my entire life. Does anybody think that Jesus Christ cares about the U.S. equity and debt securities market? And that he's going to instruct the leaders of his church to take the money from the widow's mite, and invest it into those things instead of using it to help abuse victims, say, maybe? So I don't think the world really understands this at all. And I would love if today is the day that people understand just how rotten the leadership is, because they broke the constitution of the church and they disposed of the tithing. And here's who it was. Well, here, let me finish. They disposed of the tithing in an inappropriate way. They exercised what we call unrighteous dominion. Okay? And no member of the church should sustain these men who participated in that. And who were these men? Well, it turns out that it was the first presidency, okay? Because here it says, under the facts section, number 8, to prevent disclosure of the securities portfolio managed by Ensign Peak, the church approved Ensign Peak's plan of using other entities instead of Ensign Peak to file Forms 13F. The church was concerned that disclosure of the assets in the name of Ensign Peak, a known church affiliate, would lead to negative consequences there it is again, lead to negative consequences. Same thing they said with CIA, right? I just realized that as I was reading this, okay? Anyway, in the name of Ensign Peak, a known church affiliate would lead to negative consequences in light of the size of the church's portfolio. Ensign Peak did not have the authority to implement this approach without the approval of the church's first presidency. So who was in the church's first presidency from 1997 to 2022? Well, a whole lot of the guys that they claim you can trust completely. Here's the other problem. And this is something that most people don't understand. In the SEC document, it talks about the Council on the Disposition of Tithes. And guess who else is on the Council of Disposition of Tithes? Every other member of the quorum of the 12 apostles is on that council. They all knew, they all approved, and they all exercised unrighteous dominion in the disposition of tithes. Every single one of them, except for Patrick Kieran, who is the newest apostle and was called after all this came out. So this is not a small problem. And if the world understood the problem, things would probably work out a lot differently than they have. But that church's PR, that corporation's PR arm is so strong that they're able to spin that story exactly how they want it to be spun. And most people in the church don't even think that what happened was illegal, even though the document is found in the litigation folder of the SEC's file share. Okay? If it's in the litigation folder, everybody, it was illegal, because you don't file litigation for things that are just immoral or unethical. You only file litigation when things are illegal. Words have meaning. All right, we are at the end. Conclusion. I found something that I think is very interesting that I think people should look at. So I have a little tool that allows me to sort of peek in at the LDS scriptures based on keywords that I wrote. And I tried to look up the word accountability. And I was really surprised by what I found as it relates to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and accountability. What I found is that the people who made the topical guide for the scriptures, which is going to be like Bruce McConkie, okay, and some other committees, there is nothing under accountability that would indicate to a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints that they have the right or the responsibility to hold a leader of the church accountable for any of the things that we covered today. It appears to me that they have very purposefully not put in things about accountability that would indicate to a member of the church that we have a responsibility and a right to hold our leaders accountable when they are out of the way. But everybody can go look this up for themselves, and they can read all the scriptures that are in the topical guide of the LDS scriptures, and they can see that none of it has anything to do with holding leaders accountable. And that's important because there's most definitely some scripture about this. In the book of Timothy, it talks about this, and it says, against an elder receive not an accusation, but before 2 or 3 witnesses. Now, that is some King James language that is a little bit difficult to understand, but let me tell you, the translation of that is not, don't ever receive an accusation against elders, but if there are 2 or 3 witnesses, go ahead and receive it against anybody else. That is not what that translation is. And I have a degree in ancient Near Eastern studies, so I know a little bit about translating ancient languages, okay? The translation of this is, make sure that you don't receive an accusation against an elder when it's just one person. But if there are 2 or 3 witnesses, then you need to receive that accusation, because God is not a respecter of persons, is he? Okay. So are there 2 or 3 witnesses? Well, that's a little bit problematic, because right now I'm kind of the only one talking about this. And I'm kind of the only one who really understands a lot of this. So I need somebody else to step up and, again, either tear my argument apart and leave me with my shame manifest, like the Doctrine and Covenants talks about, or I need a second or third witness to step in and say, hey, no, this is like real. And the leaders need to be held accountable through the law of common consent, which is in the Constitution of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And we need to stop consenting to letting these corporate leaders suck the life out of the spiritual body. Okay? Sorry, that was a little bit of a tangent, but here's the scripture. Against an elder receive not an accusation, but before 2 or 3 witnesses. Them that sin rebuke before all, that others also may fear. So as I was getting excommunicated, I was told over and over and over again, Justin, you can't talk about this publicly. Justin, it doesn't matter what they did. You can't tell anybody what they did publicly. You shouldn't be writing about this, Justin. It's not your place. You're out of your lane. I was told over and over and over again. But the scriptures tell me that we are to rebuke them before all. if I'm right, which is a big if. But if I'm right, this rebuke needs to happen in front of the entire world because what they've done is unconscionable. And in order for the next generation of leaders to fear, these men need to be brought to task in front of everybody, which has already started with the SEC stuff, except that they spun it. So we need to keep advocating that this corporation be held accountable for their actions instead of giving everybody the benefit of the doubt for what the church says, because anybody can say anything, but actions reveal its intent. So Paul goes on to say, I charge thee before God and the Lord Jesus Christ and the elect angels that thou observe these things without preferring one before another, doing nothing by partiality. Okay, that's an important formula before God, Jesus Christ, and elect angels. And without saying too much about that, every temple-going member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints should recognize that formulation. It is the most sacred and binding way to say something in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints that you can say. And what does Paul tell us? We should do it with impartiality, with no partiality. That means that if a leader commits a sin, they do not get partial treatment because they're a leader, because they have the second anointing, because we like their smile, or the fact that they can wiggle their ears like we did with Thomas S. Monson, who was covering up abuse. We administer the best form of justice that we can. Okay? Here's my last pitch. I think I might have to do something here. My last pitch for everybody watching this today is this. One of the worst things that the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints was engaged in extremely racist behavior for 150 years or something like it. It was a long, long time. And then they had the gall to get up and do this. This was a general authority by the name of Alexander Morrison, who in September 2000 got up in general conference and gave this quote. He said, how grateful I am that the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints has from its beginnings stood strongly against racism in any of its malignant manifestations. That is the biggest bunch of baloney that I have ever heard in my life. But this is how powerful these church leaders think that they are. They think that they can be racist for 150 years. And then when they finally decide to do the right thing, they think they can get up in front of a worldwide audience and claim that they never had anything to do with racism. They've always been against racism, when there is so much historical evidence that proves it otherwise. But that is how powerful they think they are. That is how powerful they believe that the cultural conditioning is. And often they are right. I would like to invite everybody watching this to talk to your family and friends and not let the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints get away with hurting the most vulnerable members of their flocks, the abuse victims, for 150 years before we get some other Mormon general authority up in general conference saying, oh, we never tolerated abuse in the church, and we've been against it from the very beginning. Because just like they were racist, they do not have the proper tools to care for the most vulnerable members of their flock. But we need to hold them to account today, not in 150 years. Because just like racism, the effects of abuse in a family are intergenerational, aren't they? And if we wait 150 years, there will be nothing left to protect. There will be nobody left to protect in 150 years if we don't hold them accountable now and get the programs in place and the people in place who can protect these most vulnerable members of the flock. So I would plead with you, if you are watching this show, to try to tear down the argument. And if you can, then I deserve to have my shame made manifest, and I would encourage you to do that. But if I am right, don't ever stop talking about what we've covered here today until this corporation does the right thing. Don't ever stop talking, even if you're an ex-Mormon, even if the missionaries show up on your doorstep. I want you to talk about David Kennedy to those missionaries if they show up on your doorstep and say, well, why should I join your church when you have a shadow government that harms abuse victims? And let's force the conversation today, because if we wait, there will be nothing left to fight for. So I hesitate to do this, Emma, and you can cut this out if you want to at the end. But when I was a member of the church, we were encouraged to do things in the name of Jesus Christ because we considered ourselves disciples of Jesus Christ. And I know that I've been excommunicated from that organization at this point. But today, I want to offer that invitation to you in the name of Jesus Christ, whom I still serve despite the fact that I was cut off from my people and told that I was no longer welcome to communicate with my brothers and sisters. And so I do that. I make this offer and I plead with you in the name of Jesus Christ to not let them get away with this. Thank you so much for having me on and letting me be here and do that. And it's very healing for me on my journey. I'm just so grateful for your show and your willingness to bring people on to have these types of conversations. I know it's hard. I heard about your YouTube channel, and it's a shame that we live in a world that won't let us talk about these things without giving us strikes or putting scarlet letters on us or excommunicating us or destroying our life's work or those kinds of things. I hope that our children and our grandchildren can grow up in a different world than that. And if so, I know that you're going to be a big part of that. So thanks for having me on.
It is an honor to have you on, and it's great to see strong men like you stepping up. For far too long, I've seen women coming up and speaking on behalf of children. And of course, there's been men, but there's been an overwhelming amount of women survivors and advocates who have been coming forward. And just now, these last few years, I feel like there's been an influx of men who are coming forward, speaking about their own abuse, and then really standing by the women who have been coming forward, as well as the children, and I'm so
Yeah,
grateful that you chose to go on this journey. I know that what you're going through is difficult. Um, it's a shame, like you said, that we suffer consequences for standing up for kids, and that the best interest of a lot of, whether it's a social media platform or an institution, a conglomerate, that a lot of what they care about is their reputation, how you've gone over, and the best interests of the leadership and how they're viewed. And it's not to protect our most vulnerable,
yeah,
and I think that's really confusing for people, because these leaders that we're trusting to protect and to provide safe places, safe spaces, we are taught to not question them, to just respect them because they're a leader, because they're a CEO, because they're high ranking and whatever it is that they're doing, and then as well as their associations around them. And the last thing that anybody wants to confront, of course, is that people that they've been trusting could be doing such horrific and heinous things behind the scenes, whether directly or indirectly, abuse or covering it up. We really do have to understand how this happens, because they are very quickly infiltrating, every aspect and facet of society. And because we're not educated on how this happens, and even how, our government ties in with this, and how there's crossover. You can have somebody who is a pastor at a church who's also a Freemason at a lodge who's also working for the CIA. That's really
right.
hard for somebody to think that one person could do all of that. And in fact, there's many people that balance many hats, but really predominantly show one to the public that they really want us to know. And what this whole presentation did so well was demonstrate how this infiltration can happen, how it's not just this thing that happens one day. It's a creep. These people are very patient. They're willing to wait 150 years, knowing that the person that started it won't even be around to see the final result,
You
right? They're
bet.
determined to
Yeah,
make this happen no matter how long it takes. And, we have to really understand that, just like how people will do that for something good, like how we say, you can plant a tree today and, 120 years, somebody will reap the benefits of it, it's
yeah,
sort of the same thing. Like, you can start a bad journey and a bad situation and have it continue on. And if people don't find out about it, it's going to grow into something very toxic, disgusting, and how you said, unstoppable. If we keep this up and we're not stepping up and standing up,
yeah.
we're not going to be able to stop this. And that's a really scary thought. And so I
Well,
really appreciate you sharing all that,
yeah,
because it really fills in a lot of puzzle pieces.
you bet. I think there's just one thing I want to say about that. I feel like it's really interesting, Emma, because like you mentioned the fact that it's mostly women who've been in this space. And I firmly believe that it's going to be women who lead us through this journey because my observation of the world is that when we get ourselves in really bad scrapes like the one we have, there's a masculine way to try to fix the problem, and there's a feminine way to try to fix the problem. And the masculine way is to do what I'm doing, which is to research and then to pound a hammer, right? Get a nail and pound a hammer, or cut a branch off, or fight a war, right? Where people die. And that's certainly one way to do it. But I don't think that there's any way to win this particular battle fighting a war like that. I think that's what people have tried to do, and we lose. But what's the one thing that transforms everything? It's love and nurturing and tenderness. And the reality is that a lot of these men who I'm fighting against were abuse victims themselves. And the thing that's going to pull them out of it is that feminine energy and that love of women who say, look, I love the church and I'm not going to walk away. Men, we just walk away, right? We flip you the bird and we just walk out the door. But women who love this church and love all their churches aren't going to do that. But they have the strength of character and the fortitude to look at it and say, I will not abandon my church, but I will not condone your behavior either. And I will hold you accountable. And I've seen it over and over and over again, where like we try to fight a war and it doesn't do any good. And then the love of a woman comes in and heals everything, doesn't it? And so I really believe that there's a reason that it's women in this space who are leading the way. And it's an honor to be a part of it. But by no stretch of the imagination do I ever want to have any sort of person believing that I'm leading anything involved with this. Like I am more than happy to follow my sisters on this one, because we took an eternal organization and we turned it into a fraternal organization. And to turn it back into an eternal organization, I think we may need to let the ladies lead out here a little bit. So I'm more than happy to just follow and play a role and be a part of it. But I'm just so grateful for the strong women and the kind women and the loving women who lead the way in this particular battle where it comes to abuse in the church.
I agree with you a lot on that, and I think women feel more confident being feminine, knowing that there's men supporting them, because there's not in these institutions. It's very masculine driven, like you said, so they don't leave room for that feminine energy. So it's wonderful to have men who do see that and who are coming up and adding their piece to it, standing by us and, working just like how we're supposed to. We each have our strengths and weaknesses and we complement each other. We need both to help with this. And, we need to all step up and reprioritize how we look at other humans. We're so hell-bent on worshiping our work and worshiping these things that just don't matter, and putting humanity to the side and saying, well, you're just a kid, you have to go to daycare and you don't matter, and I'm a mom, I have to just go work, I'm not supposed to care for my kids, that's not how society wants me to do it. And we've really lost track of having empathy for our fellow humans, and when you hear about these cases, I don't know how somebody's heart can't just shatter and for them to want to do something. And so I think that's why it's so important that research like yours is shared, because until you actually understand how it happens and you understand how many are affected by it, it doesn't really tug on people's heartstrings, I don't think. And it takes men like you to give other men courage. There's a lot of men in these leadership positions. And so I think the stigma around men coming out, especially abused men, and then along with, things like cover-ups and bad things that these people are involved in, they're scared to come out and say that they partook in it, when in fact, they'd actually be looked at as heroes if somebody from that church came forward and said, hey, I'm going to wipe my hands clean. I participated in all of this and I'm not going to do it anymore. And I'm going to expose everybody else who took part in it and we're going to stop it. People are
Yeah.
so scared to do that because they think that the repercussions are going to be opposite, when in fact, I think that's what would make religion more trustworthy and would help create that safe space immediately, if people would just come forward and say, hey, I did some bad things, I don't want to do them anymore. Like, we would
Yeah.
all have compassion for that and say, great, teach us how it happened, who's involved, and let's fix it right now.
Well, I'll tell you what, Emma, it's really funny that you bring that up, because I have done pretty much exactly the opposite of what you just encouraged. Like, and there is a Justin Riggs abuse story. There is. And I've chosen not to tell that story in full, but maybe it's time. And I'd be honored if you were willing to let me come back on at some point. And I don't know exactly when that can be, because I am involved in some litigation and there are a lot of innocent people involved. But I think you're exactly right. And I'll tell you what, I'm gonna commit now that I'll give you the exclusive when it's time for me to tell my story in that way, instead of just telling the story about everybody else's abuse, which I've done a pretty good job of. I'll come back and I'll give you that opportunity to, if you'd like it, I'll tell my story because I was somebody who was abusive because of the household that I grew up in. And that story needs to be told at some point too, right? And look, in the end, anybody who looks you in the eye and says that they've never done anything abusive is certainly not a person that you should trust completely because we all do it, don't we? We all abuse, don't we? At one time or another in our lives. So I'll come back and I'll tell my story to you, and to anybody who'd like to listen to it. Not because my story is important, but I think that the point you make is important, that if somebody doesn't stand up and just admit what it really was, then how are we ever going to move forward? So thank you for creating that space to allow for that.
We'd be honored to have you on. And in fact, many of my guests, if not all of them, and you even detailed it in the PACE memo, a lot of the victims, even in the LDS church scandals, were forced to perpetrate as
Yeah,
children, however old they were. That's a part of it, and whether it's forced or whether it's something that is a side effect of not having the right tools to heal from trauma, you're right. Like that is something, and there's so much shame around it and saying, I messed up, or I went through this, when in fact those are the things that really like bond us together and make other people feel less alone and feel less afraid to share what they went through so we can actually start the process of healing. Like all of this is just, it's all the root of all of this bull crap in society is childhood trauma. Like it really is, and child abuse.
yeah,
Like we live in a society that's really become the foundation of it, not honoring the child and protecting the child and keeping children safe and loved. It's like this child abuse perpetuating, society of,
yeah,
traumatized adults who don't have help, safe institutions that aren't trauma informed to help.
yeah,
And, children who end up getting that generational trauma passed down to them just because these conversations aren't being had enough. So anytime you want to come on and share when the time is right, we will embrace your story with open arms. And I know it's going to help people. And it's going to help. There will be people on the other side of the screen who need to hear your story and who will find healing from it, and people who will find the courage to start speaking out their own story. So anytime you want to come on, I welcome that. And I just can't thank you enough. This research is so extensive that you've done. I can't even imagine how many hours of time you have spent unearthing all of these documents that I'm sure are not hard to find. And some of them maybe you can't find anymore. So just thank you for, your courage to speak out, for being so supportive of survivors in and out of the church. I see you supporting the entire survivor victim community, and whistleblower community, not just the LDS church community. And you're really a role model. It's amazing what you've done with all of these situations and all this information, and how much good you're doing with it after so many generations and decades of people doing bad. So thank you for coming on and sharing all of this with us.
it's very kind of you. Thank you.
You are welcome. And before we tie up today, let's share with people where they can find you on social media. If you want to share that on your screen, or else I can share it on mine as well.
Yeah, I can share it. That's fine.
Okay.
So
I want people to follow you.
yeah. Oh gosh, I'm not sure I want people to follow me, but it's
I
one of
do.
the biggest,
You put
one of the
out so
biggest
much
surprises.
information.
Yeah, is the number. It makes me nervous, but um, so you can go to ldsabuse.info, and we have a resources page, a research page. Just so people know, we just started a data page just this week, which I'm really excited about. And so, like, you can find this presentation that I just gave on the data page, and you can go through that on your own. And then you can also find some. I was a director of analytics for a while, and so I've started taking some of the data that we've compiled, and we're starting to produce some work product to show people visually some of the things that we're learning instead of just talking about it. So that's one place, and we'll be a little bit more active there than I have been in a little while. And then the other place is obviously just Twitter, where I use the handle at LDS Abuse. And yeah, everybody is free to come here. And looks like my friend Mormon Abuse. This is another great channel that I would encourage people to follow. It's at Mormon Abuse. This is a church insider who worked for the temple department, who brought up 4 cases of abuse and was also sort of ridden out of the church a little bit. And so, but yeah, so if you follow me, you will get information from a lot of LDS abuse and other church abuse sources. And so I would encourage you, that's probably the number one place where I would recommend that you follow me is over there on X, at LDS abuse.
I agree. You're constantly putting what you've been researching and you're supporting other accounts. So especially for people who are interested in this topic and you want to learn more, please go follow Justin on social, go to his website. Really easy, free way that we can support people coming forward, and it doesn't take any time. And a lot of us are on these platforms anyway. So go to his channels, go to his social media, and please share everything and just help get eyes on him and help get this information out. You guys, to me, like, this is really groundbreaking. I can't believe that this hasn't been talked about more, because this is something that we can prove through documentation happened. It's not just hearsay. It's not something people can say is conspiracy. There's actual written documentation and articles and plenty of evidence that, hours and hours and hours of it that actually prove that this has happened. And it paints a template and a picture of how this happens. That's always a big question, why it happens and why it gets covered up and how it gets covered up, and the more we can educate ourselves on how occultism has infiltrated our industries and society, the quicker we can clean this mess up. It's time to take the garbage out. So we need more of us that care about this and who talk about it and who make it more of a tableside or fireside chat instead of these things that you can only talk about on Reddit and, in these little conspiracy holes. So the more you guys share, the more mainstream these conversations become, and the more legitimacy and validation we give to those who have suffered at the hands of these cover-ups and perpetrators who, aren't providing safety for our most vulnerable populations. So, Justin, is there anything else that you wanted to leave off with before we close up for the day?
No, that's so beautifully said. And it's your show, so you get the last word. Just thank you again for having me on. I appreciate it.
It's my honor. And I'll have all Justin's links in the show notes, you guys, as well as mine. Follow us on all platforms. Share, like I said. We can't do this without you guys. Thank you so much for listening. Bless you all, and we will see you next time.